Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Terra workshop as part of the BroadE workshop series. My name is Robert Majowski. I'm from the data sciences platform here at BroadE. I lead the user education team. And over the next few hours, we're going to get you familiar with Terra. We'll get you hands-on. And before we get started, we'll just go over some logistics. So first things first, everyone please mute your microphone if you're not speaking. So take a moment to check your microphone status and mute it if you're not about to say something. There's one link that I'd like you to jot down now if you're not staying until the end of the workshop. If you need to leave a few minutes early, take a moment and jot down our survey link. It's super helpful us to get feedback on how the workshop went and what you learned from it. If you're staying till the end, we'll give you the link again and we'll give you a few minutes to fill it out. But if you're leaving early, just jot that down now, that survey monkey link. The other links, we'll give all these at the end. So if you stay until the end, don't need to jot anything down now, but all of our materials can be found in this folder here. It's a public Google Drive folder that's gonna have all the PDFs of our slides today. You probably all had a chance to review the workshop instructions and the agenda. The workshop instructions had some information about what to do to be able to do work today, and you need to be on what's called the Terra billing project to do so. If you're not already on one, if you haven't done anything yet, if you haven't even signed up for Terra, please do that now. Please check the workshop instructions. Actually, you know what, my TAs, I realized I didn't put a copy of the workshop instructions in this folder, but everyone should have a link to it. It's linked in the calendar event, so please refer to it there. One of our TAs, my colleague Tiffany Miller, is handling billing at the start of the workshop. So if you have any questions, you need to get added to a billing project, or you have any questions, please message her, and she'll help you out. For everyone else, you're probably already all set to work with us today. So today we're going to be introducing you to a platform called Terra, and at its core, it is a platform for accessing data, running analysis tools, and collaborating on the cloud. And even before I dive into the first introductory overview, I'll just give you a couple kind of ground rules for today. If you want to ask a question, one of the easiest ways to do so is just to turn on your mic and ask. We love back and forth dialogue, so please don't feel shy, don't hesitate to do so. If you're feeling even more bold, you can turn on your video. But if you'd like to send us a message on the chat, free to do so there. We've got 4 TAs today. In addition to myself, Robert, we have Ali Cliff, Liz Kiernan, and as I already mentioned, Tiffany. We're all from the data sciences platform. We're all from user education and support. And we'll be doing the instruction today. We'll be answering questions. Yeah, so please just turn on your mic or ask a question in the chat. During the workshop today, we'll be doing some hands-on activities. There'll be times in the workshop where the instructor will say, okay, go ahead and do this action in Terra. And as computation goes on in the background, there might be a minute or two, or there's an exercise to do, which we have you take a few minutes and do on your own. To let us know you're done, use the raise your hand feature in Zoom here, and we'll remind you to do that again, I'm sure, soon. But that's a good way to let us know that you're ready to move on. If you're stuck, not ready to raise your hand, feel free to speak up or send a message in the chat. So let's take a few minutes, talk about what Terra is, what's the motivation for Terra, and what can we use it for. And then over the next about 19, 20 minutes, I'll do that short introductory slide presentation. Then we'll actually take a look at the application and just get familiar with what does the workspace look like? What does the functional component of Terra look like? That'll set you up for the next section, which we'll get a bit more detailed and hands-on. I'm sure everyone here at BroadE is familiar with this kind of a concept that data generation is on a roll. The research community is producing data sets at an ever increasingly large scale. Think back 20 years ago, Human Genome Project produced one human genome sequence. 10 years later, projects were on the scale of 1,000 genomes. Today, 2020 and now 2021, big projects like the UK Biobank or the All of Us research program from the NIH are looking to collect data sets of 1 million genomes. And it's not just genome data, it's phenotype data and multi-omics data. So the scale is always going to increase. And I'm sure 10 years from now, the All of Us, 1 million samples in a project will seem like a antiquated thing. Will be on the order of 10 million, 20 million, 50 million, who knows, 100 million. So the traditional approach in which we would share large data sets is bringing data to the researchers. There would be a governing body that manages access to that data. And then data is either, how does a researcher, sorry, did someone say something? Okay. I hear a little bit of background noise. It's just a reminder to mute your microphone unless you're speaking. Traditional bioinformatics looks like there's a central repository, holds the data. Each researcher copies it to local storage. They apply for and gain access, and then they analyze the data on their own local custom computing environment. Downsides to that, which are becoming obvious all the time, is that for one thing, this is data copying, not really data sharing, so that you don't just have one copy of data, you have multiple copies of data, and that there's an added cost to that. There is a cost across the scientific community for storing multiple copies of the same data. That adds up, especially as data sets get larger. Everyone's doing their work in an isolated computing environment. It's hard to reproduce that. It's hard to rerun an analysis when it was done on somebody's local environment. And then, the infrastructure for maintaining those computing environments has a cost. And then security is up to each individual, researcher or institution or computing environment with their own copy of the data. So all those things start to get in the way of being able to actually use the data in a sustainable way. So the cloud-centric approach is that we bring researchers to data, that there is a central cloud-based repository for the data set. Researchers access that single copy of the data in a cloud computing environment. This is true immediate data sharing. There's no downloading. There's no sending terabytes of data on hard drives. When cloud computing resources are used to analyze those data sets, this immediately helps reproducibility because people can share containerized versions of their computing environment. Computation is elastic. You just use what you need when you need it. And if you don't need it, you're not paying for it. You might be paying for a low level just to maintain storage or maintain a virtual machine in a low compute state. And security is much more centralized. And we believe and we argue that it's actually more secure to be on the cloud than in the old model. But clouds are hard to use out of the box. It's not something you just decide to do one day and you can do it. You have to worry about how do you organize data that's living in different places? How do you arrange computing resources? How do you get the tools you want to use into that computing resource? How do you collaborate with people? And how do you do that all securely? And that's really where Terra comes in. Is Terra is designed to make all those things that you might worry about a little less worrying and take away some of those headaches, and to create a platform that does a lot of that in the background. Terra is developed here at the BroadE Institute, but it's done in collaboration with our partners Microsoft and Verily Life Sciences. And what it is, it's a web interface designed to do all that heavy lifting that I just mentioned before, and help you move your analysis to the cloud, which I outlined in the last few slides, has a tremendous amount of benefits and really is a sustainable way for research and data sciences to move forward, given the scale of data that we're working with, and the scale of data we need to make meaningful insights to benefit health and people's lives. Currently, Terra supports Google Cloud. Our partnership with Microsoft is fairly new. It's started this year, so there's a lot of work on the back end going on right now for Terra to support the Azure cloud, which is Microsoft's cloud environment. That has not launched yet, so that is coming. So right now, what we're going to show you today is using Google Cloud storage and compute resources, but but multi-cloud Terra is coming. And Terra was founded on these foundational design principles, that it's open source. It is developed under open source licenses that allow you to extend and reuse the platform. Users can add custom proprietary modules. It's standards-based, with standards developed by coalitions such as the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, also known as GA4GH. It's modular, so it has functional components with well-specified interfaces that can talk to each other, and it's community-driven. It's not a monolith. It's created by many groups, and that the goal that is to foster a diversity of ideas. And Terra has core capabilities designed to support research, and we're going to take a look at these today. We're going to talk about the data library, how you can find data, libraries, including public and restricted access data that are linked directly. We're going to talk about how you can own data. We'll get you familiar with the Terra workspace, is where you can access data securely and immediately in your own functional environment, and you can share that with colleagues so they can work with you. We'll talk about the modes of analysis in Terra, one of the major methods being workflows, where you can bring in pipelines that that are community shared from places like DocStore or the BroadE methods repository, or you can bring your own through the BroadE methods repository. Those are Terra supports the workflow description language. So all the workflows we talk today will be in the WDL scripting language. And then there's interactive analysis and the Terra cloud environment on which interactive analysis applications run. And Terra supports applications like Jupyter Notebooks, RStudio, Galaxy, actually even more, Bioconductor, and Hail, among others. And there'll be more coming along in the future. Terra is envisioned as a hub. And I think the last thing I was saying when it cut out was that user portals tailored to specific audiences can sit on top of Terra and give specific research communities a community-specific way of interacting with data and analysis tools relative to their scientific interests. I'm gonna go quickly over this, but just say Terra is built very securely. It's been approved as FSMA moderate and FedRAMP authorized. You can read about those, but just know that those are excellent ratings to receive from the federal government for security, and we're routinely reviewed and audited to make sure that we are maintaining security. The last slide is just a little bit of help getting started. A couple links which you can grab from the PDFs in the folder of resources on the Terra website for getting started and getting started with cloud credits, which some of you may be doing today. Okay, I'm running a couple minutes behind, so I'm going to quickly shift over to my browser. So I'm going to go to my browser. Okay. Okay, so I should be sharing my Chrome browser with the Welcome to Terra screen. Is that what people see?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so actually, I'm going to go to terra.bio, which is the true homepage for Terra. All right, so if you go to terra.bio, this is Terra homepage. I mentioned there's a couple links on that last slide I showed. Recommend checking out all these sections. Have lots of great, particularly the science section, which shows you kind of what people are doing on Terra now in cancer genomics, infectious disease, genetics, single-cell transcriptomics, and it links you to some public resources and workspaces of researchers at BroadE and elsewhere who are actively using Terra and actually doing their research in Terra. I want to give you a quick platform tour just to show you around so you get a little familiar with, get everyone logged in, just get familiar with the application before we move on to a more in-depth hands-on session in a little while. So if everyone go to terra.bio on your browser and then click that big rectangle login button. That'll take you to app.terra.bio, which is the interface for the entry point for the application. And you're brought to this Welcome to Terra screen. There's some useful links if you're new to Terra here about finding your way to the knowledge base, learning more about the Terra platform and how we have co-branded sites with some other projects, and some links in these cards to view your workspace as an example workspace. We're going to look at all those things in the course. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. We'll get to those things. All right, so the first thing to do is to click on that drop-down menu there in the upper left. I'm actually already signed in, so I'm going to sign out so I can show you what it looks like if you're not signed in yet. Click and sign in with Google. It's going to show me my account. And now I'm logged in with my credentials. And again, message our TA Tiffany if you're having any trouble getting into Terra. So when you bring down this drop-down menu, and you look at some options here, you can see there's 4 main categories here. There's workspaces, and this is kind of the entry point to workspaces that you own or you have access to. There's the Terra library, which has 3 components to it. There's the data section, the showcase section, and the workflow section. I'm going to click on data, which is going to take us to the Terra data library. And here, this is an index of publicly available and restricted access data sets, which are connected with Terra and are interfaced with Terra. For example, I could click on a public data set, like the 1000 genomes low coverage data set. And if I click browse data, it takes me to the data explorer, which is a great and convenient way to build a cohort for analysis in Terra. So you can select, these are all clickable, so you can select various attributes of the data set, build a cohort, and then save it, and then export it to a Terra workspace. I'm not going to do that right now, but just show you that this is what the data library explorer looks like. So if I navigate back, those 3 options of the Terra library are also displayed here at the top of the browser. I'm going to go over to something called featured workspaces. Sometimes I also might call it showcase, which is what it's called here. We use the terms more or less interchangeably. If you used Terra before, you might notice that we recently redesigned the workspace, the showcase workspace session here to make it a lot easier to find what you're interested in. There's now a index on the left of tags that are associated with the workspaces, so you can find ones you're interested in. We'll get a chance to try that later as well. There's also a section for code and workflows. So this is a way to find, for example, GA2K4 best practice workflows might be interested to you. You can find those here, bring them into a workspace of your own. You can also find links to the doc store and the BroadE methods repository for finding community shared workflows or workflows that you might own that you are bringing into Terra via the BroadE methods repository. Let's take a look at a workspace, and we can choose pretty much any workspace. A workspace that I think is a nice one to look at, just to get a quick look before we move on, is the Cumulus workspace. So I'm just going to type in that here. You could do the same and click on here. So this is a showcase workspace that's been developed by some of our colleagues here at BroadE, Bo Lee and others. And it's a showcase of Cumulus, which is a cloud-based single cell or single nucleus data analysis framework. And typical of this workspace and our other showcase workspaces is that it contains everything you need to use this analysis framework out of the box. It comes with a pre-written dashboard, and the dashboard is something that you or your colleagues write. Now, I don't have permission to do anything here because I'm not the owner of this workspace. I'll talk about that in a moment. But if you're an owner of this workspace or have write access, you can click on that little pencil icon and you can edit and modify the dashboard, and it's in the Markdown language, which is a light language for writing formatted text that renders in HTML. And it comes with all the information you need to know about what's in the workspace, what are the workflows, what are the Jupyter Notebooks that are in here, what are the example data that comes along with the workspace, more about those. It also might provide you with recommended computing parameters, so might recommend specific memory requirements to make sure that this runs smoothly. It might also come with a cost estimate, which I think I already passed by. Yeah, so it comes with cost estimates, or how much it costs to run the workspace. And then it might come with also tips of what to do to run it on your own data. So if we go over to the data tab, data is where data is organized in tables. And oftentimes in the cloud, you might not necessarily be copying data to your workspace. And you might actually be just having pointers to where the data lives in the cloud. It might be in different locations. Tables are a great way to do that. In the next section, you're going to see much more about that, so I'm not going to spend any more time on it than that. I just want to quickly go back to the dashboard. A couple things I want to point out before we move on is that workspace information has a lot of helpful info about the workspace, about when it was created, what your access level to it is. So right now, everyone here would show, unless you happen to be an owner of the workspace, it should all say reader, meaning the only thing I can do is I can look at this workspace. I can't modify it. I can't run anything on it unless I clone it. And we'll get a chance to do that later by copying the workspace. And it makes a copy of the workspace that you own, and you can modify. It doesn't overwrite anything of this example workspace. It's a true clone of it. Shows you who the owner is, what the tags are, which feed into that tagging system in the showcase page, or for searching in your workspace index. And for every Terra workspace created, it creates a unique Google bucket associated with that workspace. And you can get the name of that bucket here. There's a button to conveniently copy that to clipboard. That comes in handy when you're working in your workspace and you want to run a Jupyter notebook that references your bucket or whatever. And also you can there's a link here to open that bucket in Google Cloud console in your browser. We took a look at the data tab. Notebooks tab is where Jupyter Notebooks are organized. This workspace happens to have 6 that are already here. We'll take a look at cloud environments later, but this is where, and in fact, I think the UI is going to be updated before long to just call this analysis, because it's really much more than notebooks now. You can launch a Galaxy analysis environment here, but primarily is you'll see notebooks that are listed here, and you can do various things with each notebook, like open preview, copy to another workspace, things such as that. Workflows is where WDL workflows are organized. Those can be brought in from, if you click find a workflow in your own workspace, you can bring those in from DocStore and the methods repositories we showed. And jobs history is where you can monitor workflow submissions that have been submitted in the past, have run, or are currently running. And one of the reasons I chose this workspace is just it has a set of workflow history already here that you can see, just so you can get a sense of what it looks like, rather than looking at a blank workspace. All right, so I want to finish that section there. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague. That was a whirlwind tour of the Terra workspace. We're going to look at all those things in greater depth over the next few hours. So don't worry about if you missed anything or something maybe breezed by you quite quickly. We're going to look at everything much more in depth. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Liz, who is going to talk more about data. Again, feel free to jump in with questions, turn on your mic, or drop a question in the chat. But I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Liz.
Thanks, Robert. I'm just giving it a minute to see if anyone has any further questions before we dive into our data access and data in the cloud. But I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, and hopefully, hopefully everyone can see this okay. Can everyone see this? Great.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you, Robert, for that intro to Terra. And as Robert said, I'm Liz Kiernan. I'm a science writer on our user ed team on the data sciences platform here at BroadE. And right now I'm excited to share with you how to access and organize data in the cloud in Terra. So just a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to discuss where the data actually lives when you're working in Terra and on the cloud in general, how you can bring your own data to Terra, so uploading to Terra, how you can download from Terra, and how to organize data with data tables. So let's dive into where's the data. When you're working with data, when you're working with Terra, your data will primarily be located in three main locations: the Terra data library, other external storage, or workspace storage. One of the hardest things for people to understand when they come to the cloud is that, unlike when you're working on your local system where your files might be captured in a single file folder, when you're working in the cloud, your data can be split across multiple physical locations. So it could be in external storage, like a data repository, like the data repositories that Robert showed you when he showed you the Terra data library today. Your data could live in an external collaborator's cloud storage, like an external Google bucket. Or your data could live in the workspace storage that's associated when you create or copy a workspace in Terra. And all of these different data files will each have their own unique URL. And so you can point and organize that data using data tables in Terra. So we are going to focus on how you can organize data, but first let's just talk a little bit more about these different storage options, starting with external storage, like a data repository that you would find in a Terra data library. So when Robert just gave you a tour, he pointed out that we have this Terra data library, and these contain different repositories hosting both public and private data sets. And you can go in and explore these different repositories and see if there's any use case here that might match your research interests. There's a range of use cases, so genomic data or transcriptomic data. The ENCODE project is in here, so if you're interested in epigenomic data. So again, you should feel free to go in and play and see what's available to meet your interests. When you go in and you select the browse data, you'll be taken to the data explorer that's relevant to that particular data library. This is the 1000 genomes one, but I should emphasize that these data explorers will look very different across all the different data libraries. But the goal is the same. It's to narrow down different projects so that you can create a unique cohort that meets your research interests. If you're working with controlled access data, you can link your Terra account to that controlled access data set through your profile page. So for example, if you're someone who uses dbGaP or ERA Commons, you can link by using your profile page in that profile dropdown from the Terra main menu. And so here are just a couple examples. You can link to an NIH account, a Biodata Catalyst framework service, an NCI framework service, or an Anvil framework service. You do need to renew links to controlled access data every 30 days. And you also do have the option to unlink if you don't want to keep getting reminders to relink your account. It is very important that you do renew links in a timely manner, because if, for example, you're running a multi-day analysis and your link expires in the middle of that, you will lose your access to the data. So just be mindful of that if you're working with controlled access data. Another type of cloud storage that you might come across is a requester pays bucket. And these are usually curated data sets, and you pay to move the data. This will automatically be charged to your workspace billing project. And you can also do this from command line using Google's suite of tools, GSUtil. We give a little example on how to do this from your terminal if you wish to specify a project to bill. The project to bill is the project ID of your workspace Google project, not necessarily the one you are copying from. So if you clone a workspace, you're not going to use that person's project to bill, you're going to use your own. Hopefully that'll make a little more sense as we're cloning workspaces today. Another storage option that you might come across is data in an external Google bucket. And so you might have a collaborator who has data files in a Google bucket that you want to have access to. You yourself might already be up on the cloud and have a Google bucket that you want to provide access to other users. So one way that you can provide permissions to external cloud storage is using groups in Terra. Here's a screenshot of what this looks like from the Terra main menu. You have this groups icon, and you can essentially add users to a unique group. And then in the Google Cloud Platform, you can modify permissions for that group to give them access to a Google bucket. So basically, you can add the whole group to your Google bucket. And we do have support articles for how to do this that are linked in these materials. So feel free to check that out if this applies to something you want to try doing. And lastly, you have data that might live in your workspace storage. So as we've already mentioned, every time you create a workspace in Terra or copy an existing workspace, you generate a dedicated workspace bucket. And right now, in this case, it's a Google bucket. This will be unique to you. And so you can choose to store files in that Google bucket. And as you're running analyses, your data will write to that Google bucket, unless the workflow provides an option to write to a different location that you want to write to in the cloud. And one other form of storage in your workspace that we haven't gone into quite yet is your detachable persistent disk. So in Terra, you have an option to create a virtual computer in the cloud. And every time you do that, it'll generate a persistent disk that you can store files to as well. So you're going to get a little bit more hands-on activity with creating a cloud environment, generating a virtual computer later on in this workshop. Okay, so now that you know what kind of storage options exist in the cloud, how do you actually bring your own data to the cloud? So let's say you don't want to use an existing Terra data library. How could you just bring your own? So the first thing that you would want to consider when bringing your own data to Terra is whether or not you want to protect that data, if it's some sort of managed access data, and if you want to protect any analysis that's done on that data. If the answer is yes, then you might want to consider making an authorization domain, which is something you need to set up as you create a workspace. So what is an authorization domain? You can think of it like a badge. Whoever has access to the authorization domain carries that badge. And you can't access the workspace or the data generated in the workspace unless you're part of that authorization domain. This authorization domain stays with the workspace. So once you create a workspace with an authorization domain, you cannot make a copy of that workspace without having that authorization domain. And you also can't delete the authorization domain. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're working with these. And when I say it protects all data in the workspace, that means any phenotypic data, any derived data. So if you perform Jupyter Notebook analyses or workflow analyses, and it does protect data from multiple sources. Okay, so once you've decided if you want to make an authorization domain or not, you can create your workspace. Right here, we're showing you how you can do this from the workspaces page in Terra. We're going to show you this also when we go live on the platform. But essentially, you can just use a plus icon here. And when you create a new workspace, you'll give it a unique name. You'll choose a billing project from the dropdown. And down here at the very bottom, this is where you'll decide if you want to add an authorization domain. So if there's only a specific group of people that you want to have access to this workspace, this is where you could put that group ID in and create a workspace with an authorization domain. Okay. Once your workspace is created, there are a couple of ways that you can actually add data files to your workspace. You can use the files section of your data page. So this files section is integrated with the Google Cloud Platform with the Google Storage bucket associated with the workspace. And you can add files to that Google bucket using the plus icon here. This is useful when you're only transferring either small files or small numbers of files. You can also add files directly from the Google Cloud Platform side. So here you're looking at a screenshot of the Google Cloud platform, and you have the option to upload files here. Again, this integrates with your, if this is your workspace Google bucket, it integrates with that data page in Terra. So whatever you upload on the Google Cloud platform side, you'll also see on the Terra side in that files section. Again, useful for small files and small numbers of files. But what if you're moving larger files, or if you're more programmatic, if you're more comfortable using command line, you can move files using GSUtil, which is the Google provided utility for working with cloud files. This is pre-installed in Terra for interactive analysis, and you can also install it on non-Terra systems, meaning you can install it on your personal computer, HPC, etc. This will be useful, again, for moving those larger files where you can provide a huge list of files that you want to move at once. All you need to do is initialize GSUtil when you start using it on your local, and you can do that with the gcloud init prompt. It'll ask you to put in a Terra billing project. And again, if you want to learn more about moving files using GSUtil and other ways, we recommend you go to the support articles for additional information. Once your data is in Terra, you can organize it with tables. And you can think of data tables like built-in spreadsheets. So they help you keep track of all of those files that are in the cloud environment. Now, to understand data tables in Terra, there's one term that you will see very often when working with tables, and that's this term data entity. So an entity is essentially a thing or piece of data that's stored in a data table. So you can think of an entity as a sample, a participant, a set. It's basically what you want to analyze. So data tables in Terra are named by an entity. And today you'll see examples of this, and also see how when you're running a workflow in Terra, you'll need to specify the root entity. So that's just a way of saying what data table do you want to use that contains that minimum amount of data that you want to analyze. So I just wanted to use this today to just introduce you to this idea of entity, because we're going to be saying that word a lot. And if you are someone who previously used FireCloud, you might be familiar with what were predefined entity types. There used to be 5 predefined ones: sample, sample set, participant, participant set, and pair set. But in Terra, you can define a data table in any way that you want. You're not limited to only using these terms. You can come up with whatever name you want that makes sense for naming your data table. So let's take a look at the data page and look at some examples of the sections dedicated to the different data types here. So when you come to your data page, you'll notice 3 sections dedicated to hosting different types of data. There's a tables section at the top, and this is where you could create different data tables for your input data. So here you can see examples of a participant, a sample, and a sample set table. You can also use the reference data section. If you were to click the plus icon here, you would have the option to automatically create a data table that hosts human reference files. So basically anything you would need to do genomic analysis, like your FASTA files, dictionary files, reference files, etc. This would be, we have 2 options available, the B37 and HG38 references. And then lastly, if you're not using human data as a reference and you have other reference files you need to pull in to do your analysis, you can use this workspace data table that's in this other data section. So this is where you would use any, include a key for any data that you want to essentially apply to all of your different input. So again, this could include reference files for non-human species or very specialized reference files, but it could also be things like a string or an intervals list or a Docker image that you want to specify when you're configuring workflows. And last thing I want to point out is this file section one more time. Even though this isn't a data table in Terra, it is another place where you can host data in Terra. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about these input tables. So input tables can basically hold any information you want about your different entities. So, and again, the entity can be a sample, a subject, etc. When you're looking at these data tables, the first column of any data table is going to be an ID column. So if you're looking at an entity table, it's going to be an entity ID. Here we're looking at subject ID. And the columns can contain any information that describes the entity in each row of the data table. This can host phenotypic information, like this example here, we've got BMI and HDL. And you can add as many columns and rows as you need to any data table. You're not limited to phenotypic information, though. You can also host links to genomic files as well. So here we're looking at an example sample table. Again, first column is the ID. And you can add columns to this table that point to different files. In this case, these are CRAM files and index files that belong to these different samples. So you can do both phenotypic data tables, genomic data tables, mixes of the two, and you can link different data tables together by using the different ID columns present in the table. I also just want to mention that the data tables do integrate with the workflows page. So when you run a workflow in Terra, like we're going to do today, you can call information from these different data tables. So you'll get a sense of how this is integrated as we keep going. You can modify data tables in Terra. You can modify both whole rows. You can delete whole rows in Terra by selecting the row, and then you'll have the option to delete it. You can also modify the individual cells in a Terra data table by clicking the pencil icon. And this is just showing you an example of that. When you click that pencil icon, you see the full address for the file here, and you can modify that in real time. And if you want to completely modify a table or add a whole new table, you can do that as well. Data tables are created by creating a load file or a TSV file. So you can upload a whole new file. We're going to do an example of that, a hands-on activity of that today. But you can also download an existing TSV file. So the TSV for the data table you're looking at, you can modify that and re-upload it. If you're more programmatic, you can also modify data tables in Terra using the FireCloud Service Selector or FIS Python library. And again, we have some supporting documentation that goes a little bit more into detail on FIS and what you can do with it. So once you have your data organized, maybe you run a workflow and you want to know how you can download that data from the cloud back to your local machine. So there are a couple of ways you can do that. Once again, when you run a workflow in Terra, unless you specify otherwise, it will write to the Google bucket for the workspace, and you can access that Google bucket through the files section and just click on the links to download the files. You can also click on links that exist in a data table. So if you wanted to, for example, download this CRAM file, when you select that link, you can download it or you can view it in the Google Cloud Storage. So again, if you only have a couple of files that you need to download, you can do this through the Terra platform itself. You can also download directly from the Google Cloud platform. And just as you can do with uploading, you can use gsutil to download files. So we have an example command line code that you can use if you want to use the gsutil option for downloading different files from your Google bucket. All right. So I know that was fast, and we're going to move now into some hands-on exercises so that you can get real practice actually doing some of these things. But before we dive into that, are there any questions that people have about data in the cloud or different use cases? And I can't see my chat. So TAs, if there's anyone asking anything in the chat, I'm happy to answer things out loud too. Okay, all right, so let's get a little hands-on. I'm going to show you, oops, sorry. We're going to navigate to one of the workspaces we're going to be using today. So let me just go in here, go to the Terra. So I'm going to show you how to find the data tables quick start workspace that you should be able to work in today and play around with. So to find this workspace, you're going to go to the Terra main menu, go to your that vertical three line icon, sorry, the horizontal three line icon. Go to the library section, the library dropdown, and go to showcase. And that takes you to that featured workspaces section that Robert showed you. If you go to the getting started section here, you can see a couple of quick start tutorials. Right now, we're going to use this data tutorial. So I'm going to click that. And that takes me to the Terra data tables quick start. This is the workspace we want to work in today. So go ahead and find that workspace. I think our TAs will also paste the link to that workspace in the chat. All right. So the goal of this workspace is to get you a little bit more comfortable understanding how Terra data tables and workflows can integrate, and also how you can yourself make a Terra data table from scratch. So there are several exercises that we're going to be walking through today. First, we're going to run data. We're going to run on data from a single entity table through a workflow. We're going to make our own single entity data table. We're going to show you how to run sets of single entities. There are a couple of ways we can do this and how to make data tables for those sets. And then we're going to show you how to use sets as input, set tables as input to a workflow. A couple of things I just want to point out about this workspace when you come to it, like all of our tutorial workspaces, this should be read only when you come to it. We're going to need to make a copy of the workspace in order to actually do the exercises today. And if you scroll down, you'll notice that this workspace also contains a video, a walkthrough of using the workspace, as well as step-by-step instructions for each part or each exercise. So I highly encourage you to come back to this workspace after the workshop and check out these step-by-step instructions, because there are some really rich details in there that we might not necessarily discuss today, but it might match your might be something useful for your use case for why you're using Terra. Okay, let's go ahead and clone this workspace, and then I'll give you a little extra tour of what the different workspace features here. So to clone this workspace, we're going to go to the vertical three-dot icon in the upper right of the workspace. So select that, and then in the drop-down, click Clone. Okay, that's going to pop up this dialog box where it's going to ask you to make a workspace name. We recommend appending your initials and the date for your name. And that's just because we're all going to probably be making a copy of this, and we want to have a unique workspace name to help us find our workspace later on. For the billing project, if you have your own billing project, you can use that. Otherwise, I think we're using this workshop-BroadE-October 2021. TAs, it might be nice to just put that in the chat as well, so that people can find it. So this is a temporary workshop billing that we've set up for today's workshop. The description here is populated from the workspace dashboard. We don't need to do anything with that. And we're not using any kind of protected data today, so we don't need to put an authorization domain on our workspace. So once you've filled in a unique workspace name in your billing project, you can go ahead and select Clone Workspace. And if you run into problems where you don't have that billing project, please send the email that's associated with your Terra account to our TAs in the chat so that they can get you set up on the billing account if necessary.
Liz, here's a question from the chat.
Yeah.
Do you need to assign an authorization, excuse me, do you need to assign an authorization domain anytime you're using controlled access data?
That's a good question. And that might have to do with the agreements with the people that who gave you access to the controlled access data. So there are protections in place in general for controlled access data. So you might not necessarily have to create an authorization domain, but if you want to have that fine control over the analyses that you're doing with the data and the ability of others to share the workspace, that's when you'd want to set up an authorization domain. Does anyone else have more that they'd like to add to that from our TAs? Okay, all right. I think then hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Liz.
Okay. All right. So now that I've made a clone of this workspace, a couple of things you'll notice, I'm now an owner on the workspace. So that means that I can control, I can write to this workspace, I can read this workspace, and I can share this workspace. Let me just take you on a little tour of what we have in this workspace. So if we go to the data page, we'll see that we have a couple of data tables filled in. We have a specimen data table, which I'm going to go over in just a minute, but this is preloaded in this workspace. And we also have our workspace data table, which has some reference files listed in it. This workspace also has some workflows. I'm just going to show you these from the workflows page. So if we come to the workflows page, we see that we have two workflows that we're going to be using today: single input workflow and sets as input workflow. And if I click into the workflow, we come to the workflow setup page, where we can see the name of the workflow, the version, where that workflow is located in the cloud. In this case, this is hosted in the BroadE methods repository. And we can see that this workflow is pre-configured to use inputs that are defined by a data table. If you go to the bottom of the workflow page here, you can also look at the script for the workflow using the script tab here. And you will notice that there's an inputs tab with inputs pre-configured. So when you import a WDL workflow to Terra, Terra integrates with WDL. And so Terra can read essentially the inputs that are part of your WDL script and generate this table that allows you to configure the different input files. Similarly, if you go to the outputs page here, Terra will also read outputs from a WDL and provide you the option to configure the output files, so where you would like to write those output files to. Okay, so we will be going over how to set up these workflows in just a moment, but let's go back to that data page and talk a little bit more about what we're going to be doing today and what this data table contains. So here we're looking at a specimen data table. We can see it has 3 columns. Each row of this data table represents some specimen. If I extend this out, you can see that we have some neuron data in here, some PBMC data in here. We have a participant column that tells us a little bit more about the species of data that we're looking at here. And we also see that each specimen in our data table has a FASTQ file associated with it. And if I click on this link, you can see that that FASTQ file lives in the cloud. It lives in a Google Cloud bucket. I can view it by clicking this view this file in the cloud storage. I can download it to my local machine. And if I'm more comfortable using terminal, I can copy and move this file using gsutil. When files are stored in a Google bucket, they'll also have a URL, a special Google URL called a URI. It starts with this GS:, and so you can actually see where the URL where this file lives in the cloud by just scrolling over. Okay, so what we want to do today is take in these FASTQ files for these different specimens and run a workflow on these FASTQ files. We want to do something to our data. So today we're going to be using a workflow. It's a very simple workflow, kind of like a hello world workflow, that's going to take in a FASTQ file, unzip it, read the first line of that FASTQ and echo that first line and send that echo to a text file. And so our goal for today is to run that workflow and send that text file output back to a data table here. And we also want to create our own data table and repeat this process. So that's what we're going to start with today. And to kick things off, we're just going to start by showing you how you can run one of these FASTQ files through that workflow. So right now, I'm just going to demo these first couple parts, and then I'm going to give you some time to do some hands-on exercises as well. So to run one of these entities, I'm just going to select the checkbox next to the left of any one of these different entities. I'm going to choose the first one. And when I select that checkbox, you'll see that I have one row selected, and there's this vertical 3-dot icon. I'm going to click on that icon and choose the open with, and then I'm going to choose the workflow option. And right now for this, I want to run the single input workflow. When I select that workflow, it takes me back to that workflow configuration page that we were just on. And because I've selected this entity from the data table, my workflow is automatically going to be set up to run the workflow with the input defined by the data table. In step 1 of this configuration page, it's asking me to select a root entity type. And again, that's just basically saying what data table has the unit that you want to analyze. In this case, I want to choose my specimen table because it has the specimen that has the FASTQ file that I want to analyze in it. If I wanted to change my selection, if I didn't want to choose that first specimen in my data table, I could use that select data option to change the selection here. So I could choose a different entity to run on. You can also search for different data using the search function up here. So if you have a lot of samples in your data table, you can look through and find the samples that you want to actually run on. Okay. Now, again, this workflow is pre-configured for us, but I'm going to walk you through how you could set up this workflow. So this workflow in particular has 2 inputs. It requires an R1 FASTQ file. That's the file we're going to take in and echo the first line of. And it also requires a sample ID. Now, if I want to pull these inputs from a data table, I can do that by using the this dot syntax. When you use this dot, it pulls the column options from whatever you've set as your root entity table. So to show you how this works, I'm just going to start typing this dot. Let me increase my window here. And so here you can see that the dropdown now lists the names of those data table columns. And just to convince you that that's true, and also to use this in a little bit here, I'm just going to open up the data page. So here's our specimen data table, our 3 columns of the specimen data table. So you can see it really is pulling that information from there. So if I want to pull data from the FASTQ file for this specimen, I just have to state the column that contains the FASTQ file. So I'm going to do this dot and start typing R1 FASTQ, and I can choose that option. We can do the same thing for the sample ID. So for the sample ID, I just want to use whatever the ID was for that specimen. So I can just choose that specimen ID column in the data table. For the outputs, I want to write my output back to my data table. So this output is going to be, again, the header of the FASTQ file. So in this case, I'm going to make a new column for my data table called FASTQ header. So let me go back to my data table and just show you that currently there's no column in this data table called FASTQ header. We're going to be creating that column when we configure our outputs. And by using the this dot syntax, I'm saying, Terra, write a new column called FASTQ header back to my root entity table. I don't have to call this FastQ header. I could name this new column anything I want. Once my output is configured, I can run my analysis. So I'm going to select run analysis and launch. And this is going to take me to the job history page where I can track the status of my workflow. So we're going to come back to this in a moment and see how this run did. And we'll also go back and look at our specimen data table and see how it writes the output back to this table. But while we're waiting on this, I'm going to show you how you can create a data table from scratch that could also work with this workflow. So to create a data table from scratch, we just need to create a TSV or text file. You can do this using your favorite editor. Right now, I'm just going to do this in Excel. So instead of calling my data table specimen, I'm going to call it a sample data table. And just like in the specimen data table, the first column of my sample data table needs to be a unique ID. And in Terra, when you create these tables, it has to use a very specific syntax. So to create that first column, you have to say entity, colon, whatever you want your entity name to be. So in this case, I want to call my table a sample table, and then underscore ID. All right. The second column of my table is just going to be the link to my FastQ, the cloud location to my FastQ files. So I'm just going to call this column FastQ. Okay, now to get these sample IDs, I'm going to go back to my specimen table and just use the same IDs that were listed in my specimen ID. And I'm going to take the first three. You can copy this by highlighting the name and using the shortcut, Command C, or you can use the pencil icon and copy directly from there. So I'm going to do those first three. Okay. And then for the cloud path to the FastQ files for this, again, you can go in and use that pencil icon to copy it, or I'm just going to right click on the link and copy the link address for each FastQ file for these samples. Okay. And of course, I need to save my work. I already mentioned that this needs to be saved as a text file. So I'm going to call this sample table, and I'm going to change my file format to tab delimited text. Yes, please use that format. Okay, so my table should be ready now to upload to Terra. So let's see what happens. So I'm going to go back to my data page in Terra, click the plus icon next to the tables, and then I'm going to choose that sample table that I just made. Okay. And here is my table that I just made from scratch. So I'm going to give you all 5 minutes now to do this same exercise. I'm going to keep sharing my screen so that you can see the Excel sheet. But go ahead and make your own data table from scratch. We'll give you until 2:14 to do this. And please feel free to ask questions as you're doing this. Any issues that come up, if you have a question, most likely everyone else will have a question too. So please don't be shy to unmute yourselves, ask questions, or use the chat and directly message TAs or everyone in the chat.
Liz, I have a question, please.
Yeah.
So what should be the size? Like, is there any limit on the size of the file which has to be uploaded? Like,
is there a limit on the size of the file? I don't know what the upper limit is. It's pretty high. So okay. Yeah, it's pretty high. There might be an upper limit. Does anyone know if there's an upper limit? We can find out that answer
no.
offline. But yeah, it's pretty big. So it likely will be that you don't hit that limit for uploading. But I will say that if you are uploading large files, your best bet is going to be to use the gsutil function. Otherwise, the platform might be a little slow for you if you're doing it manually from using the platform, like the upload icon.
Okay.
Liz, there's a question from Jean that says, several steps ago in the status column, it reads, failed for workflow statuses. I believe I followed your exact instructions. Might this be a billing account failure?
I don't know if it's a billing account failure, but let me just go back really fast.
Probably not a billing account failure if they copied the workspace. Right, the billing account failure would prevent them from copying the workspace. So it's probably not related to that. And if it was very quick, you could look and see it maybe you could lead through some troubleshooting, or we're going to do a troubleshooting section in a little bit.
Yeah, we are going to do a troubleshooting section. When you go into your job history, you might have a failure message here. Did you by chance get a failure message when you did it? Or you can feel free to paste any failure message that you got in the chat, and we can kind of talk through that and see. Let me just show you all the workflow configuration one more time in case someone was trying to follow along. And so once you get to your workflow configuration, you should be using specimen as your root entity. You can select any one of these files to run on. I used the first one and just selected the data. And then your inputs are already pre-configured here. So as long as you didn't change these inputs from this, the inputs should not be a problem necessarily for the workflow. And again, your outputs, this was pre-configured for you. So we'll see if others also are getting some sort of error.
There was a question about how long is the wait time for submitted jobs. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, so that's a very variable answer. Basically, it really depends on how simple your workflow is, how small your data is. I think I kind of mentioned this when we were talking about linking permissions, but some people are running workflows that take multiple days to run. So it really just depends on how big your project is, how big your pipeline is that you're trying to run, and what it's trying to do with the data. This one's going to finish pretty quickly if it hasn't already. Let me see. It should finish pretty quickly. Each of these are being launched on their own virtual machine in the cloud. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next section. But yeah, it should run pretty quickly. One nice thing about Terra is that if you are running a workflow that takes a little longer, maybe a multi-day submission, you can close out of the platform. You can completely, close out of your computer, do whatever, and come back and check it out after a while. So you don't need to worry about staying here on the actual platform to follow the job history. All right. So we are at time. It's 2:15. So hopefully people were able to upload their own data table to Terra. If anyone has any questions about uploading, please speak up if you ran into any problems with that. It could just be a labeling of the column there. That's usually the part that trips people up. All right. Okay. So I'm going to go back to my sample column, and I'm going to run a workflow from this new sample the sample data table. I'm going to run a workflow from this data table just to show you how you can change configurations in Terra. So you can just feel free to watch me for this step and see how I change this workflow setup. So I'm actually to run this, I'm going to go back into the workflows page. I'm going to go into single input workflow, and I'm going to manually change my configuration, my setup from here. So again, right now, I want to run an entity from my sample data table, not my specimen table. So the first thing I'm going to do is change my root entity, and I'm going to change this to sample. I'm going to select one of those three files that I uploaded. So just the first one, and select OK. All right. Now, because I'm using a different root entity data table, that means I'm going to have to change my configuration down here for my inputs. Because remember, these columns R1 FASTQ and specimen ID, these came from the specimen data table. So let me just show you that again. Refresh my page here. But I'm now using the sample data table, which only has 2 columns. So I need to configure these inputs to match the root entity table that I'm using. So if I type this dot, now you'll see the options for my new data table come up. So I'm going to choose FASTQ, and I'm going to choose sample ID. And then I'm going to select save. And just for fun, I'm going to show you how we can write a new column name in here. So I'm just going to call this new column my output. So this is going to write a brand new column now to my sample data table. But the same workflow is running. So it's going to read in that FASTQ file for the sample that I selected and output a text file for that. And that text file will be in this new column, my output. So I'm going to select run analysis and launch. And it'll take me to my job history page. Okay. Now, if I look at my job history, you can see that my first workflow is done. So let me return back to the data page and show you that specimen table. And here we have that FASTQ header column that we created. And inside of that cell next to the first specimen here, you see the output text file that we made. Okay, so we'll check back in on our sample data run that we just ran in a moment. But now I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about sets as input. Because most likely you will not be running an entire workflow on just a single sample. You'll likely be trying to run on sets of files. And we can kind of think of sets in a couple of ways. We can think about sets as different things that we want to just group together and run at the same time. Or we can think of sets as files that might be part of a larger sample that need to run together. So there's a couple of ways you can run sets, and we'll go through those ways. And just to illustrate what I mean by these different kind of concepts of sets, I'm going to just go back to the dashboard here and scroll down, because there are some nice diagrams that explain the different kinds of sets that you might want to create. So in one use case, you might say have several maybe like mouse and human files in a single data table, like the specimen data table that I showed you for this tutorial. And maybe you only want to run on mouse samples. Now, in this case, if you want to take in multiple inputs and then just get out 3 independent outputs, that's one type of set that you can run. And in that case, you would just use an entity data table to run that. But a second scenario that you might want to do that we're going to go over is running an array as input. So let's say you have a couple of sets of, or a few files that all belong to one larger sample. So as an example, let's say you have 3 lanes of FASTQ files, 3 lanes of sequencing. So you have 3 FASTQ files that you need to take in. And maybe you your workflow is going to output a single file for those 3 inputs, like a BAM file. In that case, you would need to run your set, run a set table to write that back to the appropriate data table. So I'm going to show you actual examples of this in a moment, and hopefully this will make sense. So let's start with that first use case where we want to just group samples together and write back to our data table. So I'm going to use the specimen table as an example. So let's say we want to create a new set using the first 3 samples in this specimen data table. And I just want to write independent outputs back to next to each of our samples that we're running. We can do this by creating a set in the workflow configuration. So if I go to workflows and go to my single input workflow, I'm going to change my root entity back to specimen, and I'm going to select the data. And I'm going to go ahead and just click now on 3 entities in my specimen data table. So I want to create a new set with these 3 entities. And I'm just going to call this set mouse set 1. And I'm going to save. Okay. Now, again, because I am running 3 inputs and getting back 3 outputs, 1 for each of those, I do want to write my outputs back to this specimen data table. I'm going to reconfigure my inputs to match this new root entity that I've chosen. So I'm going to switch back to that this.r1 fastq, and I'm going to change my specimen ID. Okay, and then save. And for my output, I'm going to go ahead and I can leave this as this.myOutput. So I'll write a new column to my specimen table that creates a column called my output. And then I'm going to run analysis and launch. Okay, so now you can see that after I hit launch on this, I have 3 separate workflow submissions, 1 for each sample that I'm running in that set. And if I go back to my data page, you'll notice something has changed in the table section. I have created a brand new specimen set data table. And in that data table, you can see the name of the set that I just created, mouse set 1, and that it has 3 entities in it. So I'm going to show you how you can use a set table like this in a workflow configuration in just a moment. But first, I want to show you how you could create a similar data table, a set table, from scratch. So for this exercise, what I want to do is create a sample set data table to match my sample table. So I'm going to go back into Excel and make a new spreadsheet here. And this is going to be a set table. So I'm going to just call this sample set. And again, it needs to be saved as a text file. Save that. Okay. All right, so if I want to create a set table, I'm going to use a different syntax for that first ID column. The new syntax, instead of using entity, I'm going to use membership. And then colon. And then I need to use the same name that I used for my entity data table. So because I'm making a sample set data table, I'm going to type sample and then underscore set underscore ID. Okay, my second column in this needs to list the samples that are part of my sample set that I'm creating. So your second column needs to match again the entity name that you've given the entity table. So we called that entity table sample. So I'm going to write sample as my second column. And for this, I am going to make a new, again, a set table, or sorry, a new set. I'm going to call this set mouse set 2. Okay, and I'm going to add 3 samples to this set table. All right. And these are all going to be part of the same set. So I'm just going to copy that set name next to each sample. All right, so now my sample set table should be ready to load to Terra. So I'm going to go back to the platform, click that plus icon, and choose that sample set table that I made. Okay, and now in the table section, you see I've created from scratch a new sample set table, lists those 3 entities that I chose. Now, one thing I want to highlight is how the name of this column has changed after I've uploaded it to Terra. So when you're creating your set tables in Terra, you need your entity name in the actual config in the spreadsheet to match your entity. So the sample needs to match the sample table. When you upload the table to Terra, Terra will automatically make, Terra will automatically make this name plural here. So it went from sample to samples. So just be aware of that. That can sometimes throw people off when they're creating their table from scratch. All right. So now let me show you how you could use this set table in a workflow configuration. So I'm going to go back into workflows and go into my single input workflow. And I'm going to choose, once again, I want to run this workflow so that it creates 3 independent outputs. So I am going to keep my root entity as the sample table because that's where I want to write my workflow output back to. But I'm going to go into select data. And now I want to use an existing set of samples. So in this case, I'm going to use that mouse set 2 that I just created. And select OK. Then I'm going to change my configuration back to my root entity table. So this dot fastq for my fastq file and this dot sample ID. And select save. And now I'm ready to run my analysis. So I'm going to launch. And once again, you can see that it's kicked off all samples independently through their own workflow. All right, let me go back to the data page and show you what it looks like. Oh, sorry, let me go to the job history first. Okay, so you can see that from the job history page that the first set that I launched is still running right now, and it will write back to the data table as each entity finishes up. Okay, so I'll show you that in just a moment. Let's see. All right. If you do look at your entity tables, you can see where it's created the new column, my output, from our previous runs. Go to the specimen, you can see it here too. And when our set workflows are done running, we should see all 3 files in here in the my output column. All right. So let's talk about now that second use case I mentioned about running sets. Right now, we've been using our entity data tables as a root entity. And it might be the case that we want to take in 3 subsets of a larger sample and output 1 single file. So for example, here in the specimen table, you see that we have multiple lanes of sequencing. Maybe we want to write just 1 output file back from using these 3 different lanes of sequencing as input. If we were to keep this specimen table as the root entity, Terra wouldn't know where to put that single file output because that single file output represents all 3 of these samples. So in this case, in this use case, we want to use our set tables as the input to the workflow. So in other words, we want to write back for the 3 entities in our set a single file that represents the analysis of those 3 samples. So for this, we're going to use a different workflow. I'm going to go in and do this sets as input workflow. And this workflow is pre-configured to take in a set table. And if you ever are curious about whether or not you should use a set or entity table, think about the inputs and the outputs of the workflow. And if you're in doubt, go back to the script of the workflow and see what it's taking as input and doing as output. So if you're taking in an array of files as input and you're outputting a single file, that's a good indication that you're going to want to use a set table. All right. So now this workflow is pre-configured, but I want to point out just a slight change in the configuration that you need to make when you're using set tables. So if we go down here and look at our first input variable for this workflow, you can see it's still expecting FASTQ files. It's expecting an array of those files. Before we can tell Terra where to find that FASTQ file, we first need to tell Terra where what specimens actually belong to our set. And so when you're using set tables, remember that the second column of that set table, let me go down here, is a specimens column that contains the entities. So first we need to tell Terra to go to this column and identify which entities are part of the set we're using. And remember, specimen set table is our root entity. So when I type in this dot, I'm only going to get the options for the root entity data table. In this case, I want to choose the specimens to tell Terra where to find the specimens that are part of this set. And then I can tell it, once it locates which specimens are part of the set, it can go back to that specimen data table to find the column with the FASTQ file in it. So it's just a slight change in configuration when you're using set tables. You just first need to tell it what entities are part of the set, and then you can call the column from the entity data table. All right. To run this workflow, I'm going to go ahead and select data. I'm just going to choose that mouse set 1. And then I'm going to launch the analysis. So run analysis and launch. Okay. Let me check back on my job history. And you can see we're still running the last set, but the first set that we ran finished. So let me go back to my data table and show you my specimen page. Now you can see that from our first set that we ran, each of the outputs is complete. When we're done running our specimen set table as input, when we're done running that workflow, we will see a new column appended next to this data table that contains the output, the single output file for these 3 entities. And I did forget to show you that in the workflow configuration. So let me just go back here for a second. Happy with me right now. Here we go. Sets as input. The output for this sets as input workflow is a single file, samples first lines output. And we're going to write it back to that specimen table as a new column called array output. So when this is done running, we'll see it here as array output. All right. Let me pause there and see if there are questions about running different data tables and the kinds of things that you can run in a data table. Did any questions come up that we should address with the group?
I think we covered all the ones in the chat already.
Okay, great. Okay, well, in this case, we can come back and check in on our job history here, and you can monitor your own job history status as we're doing this. We're going to take a 5-minute break right now, and then we will jump into learning a little bit more about workflows and WDL. So at 2:40, let's come back and we'll kick off the next section. Okay, we're going to get started now with the next section of today's presentation, specifically workflows. So I'm going to go ahead, turn on my video again. Before I jump off into the next section, again, were there any other questions that people wanted to ask? Did you run into any issues launching any of the workflows or uploading data tables? or have any questions about just working with cloud files in general. Okay, all right, so let me share my screen again, and we will kick off the next section. Oh, hold on, I just got one message here, and I'm going to, if you did run into issues uploading your tables and you want to discuss them, go ahead and feel free to unmute yourself real fast. We can talk about different issues that people might have had uploading. Again, if you have a question, most likely someone else does too. The biggest component of uploading data tables is using the correct IDs for your data table. So let's see. So for the user who's having an issue with uploading data tables, are you having issues with the entity data table, so the sample data table, or a set table? If you can just type in the chat if you want, if you're more comfortable with that. Okay, so the set table. Okay, so let me pull up that example set table again so that we can just real quick look at what you need in order to make a set table. So again, when you're making a set table, you need to have the first column have a very specific syntax. It needs to be membership : and whatever entity name you've given your entity table. So if you made a sample table, this entity name needs to be sample. And then it's _set_ID. If you made a data table, an entity data table called participant to start with, and you uploaded that to Terra, and you wanted to make a set table from your different participants, this name would be changed to participant here. So the first thing when you're troubleshooting data tables is, one, make sure your entity table is actually uploaded to Terra. You can't make a set table unless you have an entity table. So if I didn't have a sample table in Terra, I wouldn't be able to make this set table. The second thing you want to make sure is that this syntax is correct, that you have membership : sample set, or whatever your entity name is, set ID. And then the third thing is to make sure that your second column in your set table has the same name as the entity name. So if you're, again, making a sample set table, this needs to be sample.
Liz, did you want to be sharing your screen?
Oh, I did. I did.
I don't see it.
That would help. Sorry about that. Okay, this will probably make a lot more sense now when I'm pointing things out. Thank you, Allie. Yep, so here I'm looking at that sample set table. And so this is the syntax I was talking about. For making a set table, you need to have that membership : your entity name. So the entity table that I uploaded to Terra was called sample. So now I'm making a sample set table. And then your second column needs to match the entity name as well. So this needs to be sample. All right. So let me just check in the chat and see if that answers the question that some people were having. So if you wrote into me about uploading data tables, would you be able to just send a message and let me know if that answered the question? Okay, great. And for the different users trying this out, it looks like they may not have had the sample table already uploaded to Terra. So again, anytime you're making a set table, you need to upload an entity table first. You can't make a set without first having that entity table. Okay, thank you all for asking these questions. Again, these are important, and I guarantee you're not alone. Everybody runs into these issues, so it's nice to be able to discuss them. All right, I'm going to go ahead and dive into workflows, and then we're going to do some more hands-on activities. All right, so we're going to talk about data processing in Terra with workflows. Okay, and specifically, we're going to hopefully answer today, what is a workflow analysis? You've kind of gotten a flavor for it in our last section, but we're going to talk a little bit more detail about what workflows are, how you find and upload workflows for your analysis, how you can configure them to run a workflow, and how you can troubleshoot failed workflow submissions. All right. So what is a workflow? In a simple definition, a workflow is a set of instructions connecting multiple steps, and it's generally used for automated data processing. So when you're thinking about your analysis process, starting from your input data and ending in a publication-ready result, the data processing step are the steps that you take to transform the data to get them ready for something more specific, like statistical analysis or visualization. These data processing steps are general. They're going to be applied to all of the data in a set that you're running. And they can be automated, often using scripts. And so when we're doing this in Terra and we're thinking about scripts, we're thinking about scripts written in the workflow description language, which is a human readable and writable syntax. So once you have a WDL script in Terra, what's the recipe for actually submitting your workflows? How do these WDL scripts actually work in Terra? And essentially you need 3 pieces to make a WDL workflow run. You're going to need a Docker container. And for those of you who are new to Dockers, this is essentially a package of software and all of its dependencies, a portable package of software and dependencies. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. You need your workflow, of course, written in WDL, and you need your data that you're going to use as inputs, the thing that you're actually going to transform. So let's talk a little bit more about these, starting with the Docker container component. Now for today, you don't need to be an expert in Dockers to use Terra and do our hands-on activities, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about Dockers. So again, Dockers are a package, a portable container of software and all of its dependencies. And these containers, or what we call images, can be hosted in public registries in the cloud. So some examples of these are Docker Hub, Key.io, Google Cloud Registry. You can go to any one of these public registries and search for Dockers that have software that meets your needs. As an example of different kinds of software that might be in a Docker image, it could be anything from GATK to aligner software like Star. Basically any software that you need can be hosted in a Docker image. And there's a couple of ways that you can use Docker images. So you can download these Docker images from public registries and go into them and use them interactively. So you can download it to your local machine and test the software out and see that it's working the way that you expect. But when you're running a workflow in Terra, you can also specify these Docker images in your WDL workflow. And I'll show you an example of that today. But when you're doing WDL scripting, there's essentially a runtime section where you can specify a Docker image. And what this allows Terra to do is pull that Docker image from the cloud to use the software that's in it. Now, if you are looking for Docker images in these public registries, you don't see any Docker image that has the software that you need, there's also options for you to create your own Docker image. And so I just wanted to call out that we have a couple of tutorials to kind of get you up and running, creating your own Docker image. So if that's you, if you're someone who feels comfortable doing that, you might want to get started by looking at these resources that we have linked in this slide deck. And again, these slides are going to be publicly available to you in a folder online. Okay, so that's Docker images. What about your workflow? What actually is a WDL script? What does it look like? So we're going to get a little practice looking at these and getting a little hands-on with this. But basically, a WDL script has 2 main parts to it. It has a workflow definition and it has tasks. So in the workflow definition, you'll notice that a workflow definition calls inputs. Here, you're looking at a couple of files that have a variable named myref and myInput. And the workflow definition will call tasks to take those inputs and transform them in some way. So this is calling tasks that will essentially use the software that you're specifying to change the data, to align it, to process it, to do whatever you want to do to the data. And then, so that's the workflow definition. And then if you want to take a closer look at what tasks are, a task is very similar to the workflow definition in that it also has inputs that you can define. So again, we have a couple of files in a string here, but tasks will also have a command section in them. And the command section is the actual section where you specify what you want to do. Do you want to call the star aligner? You can do that here and actually specify your parameters in this section that you're using for your different software. A task also has a runtime section where you can specify that Docker image that has the software that you need to do this task. And a task has an output section, and you can, again, write these outputs actually as workflow output as well. So that's kind of the high level overview of the workflow description language and how the workflow definition calls different tasks. These tasks can be found in the same WDL script as the workflow definition, but I also want to mention that you can put tasks in their own WDL script and import those tasks into the workflow. Today, we'll look at an example of a WDL that has everything written in one file. Okay. Now, in order to actually run a WDL script, you need to specify what these variables are. For example, if you're using a file, you need to tell the workflow where to find that file, like a file path. Or if you're using a string with a variable called name, you need to somehow tell it what that name should be. And when you're working with WDL, you do this using a JSON configuration file. Now I'm showing you a screenshot here of something that should look very familiar. This is the configuration page on Terra. And I already mentioned that Terra integrates with WDL scripts and pulls in the inputs. What it's actually doing is creating a JSON file for you where you can specify those attributes. And in Terra, you can download these JSON files and modify them and re-upload them to work with your workflow. So you aren't limited to specifying all of the attributes manually in the Terra platform. You can actually upload your own JSON file as well for the workflow. All right. So once you have your workflow and your JSON, how does this workflow submission process actually work in Terra? So here you are as a researcher working at your local computer. You've created your workspace, you've imported your workflow in WDL format, and you've loaded your data. When you go to that workflow configuration page in your workspace, remember that you're pulling in data from a data model. That data could live in workspace storage or some other repository. And your WDL script itself will contain the instructions for what you want to do with that data, as well as a pointer to the Docker image that has the software that you want to use. So when you do that workflow configuration, all of these pieces are being put together into a JSON file that's sent off to an execution engine. And these WDL scripts run off of execution engines like Cromwell. This is a portable execution engine. You can actually download this to your local machine and run WDLs on your local machine as well. When this information is set to Cromwell, it'll go to an API, which is on the back end going to set up essentially a virtual machine, a virtual computer in the cloud for running your workflow. So it takes all of the requirements that you need, and it sets up this virtual computer with the storage and CPUs and RAMs that you need to actually run your workflow. And it'll pull the data for running the workflow, again, either from your workspace storage, if you've uploaded files to your workspace storage, or from other storage in the cloud environment. And once this is done running, it'll send the outputs of that workflow back to your workspace storage where you can access them from your local computer. So this is just kind of giving you a sense of what's happening when you hit that run analysis button in Terra. You don't have control over setting up this Google computer. This is not something you need to do. It's all happening on the back end for you. And I say this because today you're also going to get experience creating your own virtual computer in the cloud using the cloud environments. That's not the same thing as what's happening when you launch a workflow. You don't create this VM in the cloud for your workflows. This is all being done for you. Okay. So let's get a little bit of practice working with Whittle scripts and getting a sense of how you could actually go in, download a Whittle script, modify it, and re-import it back to your workspace. Because for a lot of people, they might want to do their own Whittle scripting and get a little bit more practice with this. So we're going to do a little demo first. I'm going to show you the steps for finding what we call a Whittle puzzle. These are Whittle scripts that are missing a particular input. We're going to solve one of these together, and then I'm going to give you some time to do these same steps on your own. So what I'm specifically going to do is I'm going to go to a Whittle puzzles workspace. I'm going to show you how to find that in a moment. We're going to clone the workspace and give with a unique name and billing. We're going to solve the easy Whittle puzzle using a script, just a text editor. And then I'm going to show you how to upload that Whittle script to the BroadE methods repository and export it back to a workspace. All right, so I'm going to end my slideshow for now. And I'm going to go back and show you how to find the Whittle puzzles workspace. So, and we can also send you a direct link in the chat as well for this. But to find the Whittle puzzles workspace, I'm going to go to my main menu in Terra, and I'm going to go to the workspaces section. Now, this might take a little bit for my list of workspaces to load because I have quite a few of them. After today, you should, if you've never made a workspace before today, your list might be very small here. Okay, the workspace that I'm looking for, the Whittle puzzles workspace, is a public workspace. So you'll notice a couple of tabs on this workspaces page, one for the workspaces that you've created, a new and interesting, a featured page. That's all of those workspaces that are in our showcase section. And then there's this public option. The public option has workspaces that anyone has decided they want to make public to the world. And so today we're going to search for that Whittle puzzles workspace in the public section here. So up in the search bar, I'm going to type Whittle-puzzles, and it'll return one public workspace. So go ahead and navigate to the Whittle puzzles workspace. Okay, and I'll just give you a quick outline here. If you want to come to this workspace after the workshop and try some of these exercises on your own, you definitely can. There's instructions, an overview diagram of what you do in this workspace, as well as step-by-step instructions that are available. Again, these Whittle puzzles are designed for people who might want to get a little hands-on practice with Whittle scripting. So we have both an easy puzzle and an advanced puzzle available in here. There's also resources in the dashboard that you can go to learn more about Whittle scripting. It's kind of out of the scope of this workshop, but I just wanted to give you a little flavor for doing this today. So before I do anything in this workspace, I'm going to make an editable clone of it. So again, I'm going to go to that vertical 3-dot icon and choose clone. And I'm going to append my name and today's date to the name. And choose a billing project, workshop BroadE, October 2021 billing project. And then again, I don't need an authorization domain for this. And then I'm going to clone my workspace. Okay. The Whittle puzzles that are in this workspace are located on the data page. So I'm going to go to the data page here. And you'll notice a couple of things on this page. There's several tables that are pre-created for you. We're going to use this a little bit later on after we've solved our puzzles. So I'll go over those later. But if you navigate down to the other data section to the workspace data table, this is where you can find the 2 puzzles available in this workspace. I'm going to download the easy puzzle. And again, I'm going to give you all time to do this on your own. So please feel free to watch for now, and then I'm going to give you 10 minutes to solve your own puzzle. So to download this puzzle, I'm going to click on the link. And after a few minutes, it's going to allow me to download. So I'm going to select download. And then I'm going to open this puzzle using my favorite text editor. In this case, I'm going to use Sublime Text to open it, but you can open these in any text editor that you're comfortable with. Okay, so here we are in the easy puzzle whittle. So let's take a look at what this whittle script looks like. You can see that this whittle script has two sections. At the top here, we have that workflow definition that I was talking to you about. So you can see that we specify an input, a string, and we call a task. The task is called write greeting. And we generate an output file. If we go down to the second section here, we see that we actually define the task. So again, the task is called write greeting. It has an input as well. And what this task does is it echoes hello and a variable called name. So we provide this workflow some name input, and it will echo that and write it to an output file. And you can see that in the runtime section here, we've specified a Docker image so that we can run this workflow. Now, these whittle puzzles will contain some missing pieces in them. And for this easy puzzle, we're missing a string, a variable name for our string at the top here, which is indicated by these three dots. Now, the goal for today is not for you to necessarily understand how to write a whittle script, but some of you out there might be very interested in whittle writing. So I just wanted to give the opportunity. Does anyone know what the variable name is that might be missing from this input here by using the rest of the whittle as a clue? Can anyone take a guess? I'll take a look in the chat and see if anybody has a guess as to what this string variable name should be in here. All right, thank you. Yeah, it's the answer is name. And we know that because our task calls an input where name is set to name. So each of the variables has to be defined in our whittle script. And so if we have two variables here, we know that the workflow definition has to also have that variable. So that is the correct answer, it's name. And again, if that is confusing to you, that's not necessarily the point of this exercise. This is to get you comfortable manipulating the whittle scripts, not solving whittle puzzles. But thank you for participating in that. Okay, so once I've solved this whittle puzzle with the variable name, which is name, I'm going to save this as a new name. So I'm going to call it, let's see, just LK solved. And I'm going to save that to my desktop. Okay. All right. And now that I have my whittle script that I've modified, I can upload this to the BroadE methods repository. So I'm going to go to the BroadE methods repository using that main menu in Terra. So just to remind you where to go, you're going to go to that main menu, go to the library section, and go to workflows. And then you will have the option to choose DocStore or BroadE methods repository on the right. We're going to upload our solved whittle puzzles to the BroadE methods repository. Okay. Now, to upload a brand new whittle to the BroadE methods repository, I'm going to click on this big blue create new method icon. And then I'm going to be prompted to put in a namespace. This is just essentially a folder name that could contain multiple whittles if I wanted to upload multiple whittles. So I'm just going to call this puzzles and today's, my initials and today's date. And then it needs a name for my workflow. I'm going to call this easy solved LK 2021 demo, with the day's date, just so that I make sure that nobody else has this namespace or name. Okay, the second step in here then is it wants me to load a whittle. I can actually copy the whittle directly if I want to go into that text editor, or I can load it from file. So I'm going to go ahead and just do that. Okay. Now, when you're loading to the BroadE methods repository, you can actually modify a whittle in place. So if I hadn't solved this whittle puzzle in a text editor, I could do it here as I'm uploading to the BroadE. And if I didn't solve this puzzle correctly, I'm going to put those ellipses back in. It would actually error when I upload. So I'm going to try uploading that. You can see that I get an error message, and that's because when you upload to the BroadE methods repository, it runs a syntax checker called WOMTool in the background. So I'm going to change that back to the correct variable name and upload again. All right. So now I have my brand new workflow in the BroadE methods repository, and I can export that to a workspace. So I'm going to show you how to do that real fast, and then I'll turn it over to you all to give you time to do your own little puzzle. So to export to a workspace, I'm going to choose this blue export to workspace icon. And then it's going to ask if I want to choose a configuration. I haven't made a configuration for this, so I'm going to say use blank configuration. And then lastly, it's going to ask me to do some configuration for this workflow. The only thing I need to do is choose a destination workspace here. And so the destination workspace I'm going to choose is my clone of, let me put LK in here, the clone of the Whittle Puzzles workspace. So I'm going to just type my initials and the date. And there's my Whittle Puzzles workspace. And I'm going to export it to the workspace. And then it'll ask me if I want to go to the edit page now. That's basically asking if I want to go to that workflow setup page. And yes, I do. And it will take me right to the workflow setup for my solved puzzle. So now I'm going to hand it back over to you all for 12 minutes to solve your own puzzle. I have instructions here for you on this page. And let me just actually check back here on the time. So we're going to do 12 minutes. So we're going to meet back at 3:20. So go ahead and follow these instructions. And again, you can ask questions as you're doing this. If you run into any problems, we can show you how to navigate through those problems in real time. So yeah. Okay, we did get one question in the chat. Is there a way to access data in another Google bucket, not associated with the current workspace, and change the file name as input to a workflow? And the answer, I think, to that question is yes. From any workspace, you can access data that's hosted in another Google bucket as long as you have permissions to that data. So if you're trying to pull in a file, you can pull that file from any cloud location, and again, you can list that file from a data table in Terra. And then to change the file name as input to a workflow, could you maybe clarify what you mean by change the file name as input to a workflow? When you're configuring, are you asking if you can change the variable name in the workflow, or if you can just choose to pull in a different file to the workflow?
Yeah, sorry about the confusion. So I was wondering if I can like change the file name as input, because for some of a workflow, it actually expects a certain naming convention of a file, but the original file name do not necessarily meet that criteria. So I wonder, like, as input to that workflow, is there a way to change it?
So are you thinking about, sorry, are you thinking about the workflow that we're solving right now, or just in general?
Just in general, sorry for
Yeah.
the confusion.
Yeah, you can definitely change the name of a file name as input to a workflow. Can you think from the examples that you've seen kind of today, can you describe based on that kind of what you're asking? I just want to make sure we're answering your question. So for example, we did a workflow today that took in a FASTQ file as input, and we called that FASTQ file using a data table column. So if you're using kind of that same example, what's your question kind of in the context of that? Like, are you asking if you can change, use a different column to call a file from a data table? Are you asking if you can change the actual variable in the WDL itself? Because you can do both. I just wanted to kind of give you a concrete answer and maybe show an example of it if I can. But if that answers the question, then that's, you know, I don't have to do that either. So. Do you feel like you got an answer to your question?
Oh, we may have lost them.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, the connection wasn't so good. So I actually missed the first part of the workshop today. So I don't really know like like what would be a concrete example for that. Let me actually like think about it, and maybe I'll send you in chat box.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. And feel free to reach out to our TAs too. I think the answer to your question is yes. I was just looking for a way to kind of show you like visually what the answer was. But the answer is yes, you can pull in a file. If your workflow calls for a file, you can pull in any file that's in a cloud location as long as you have access to that location, permissions to access it. And if you need to change a workflow, modify a variable name, you can do that too. That's a little bit more work depending on what workflow you actually want to modify, but you can change WDL scripts. That's what this example puzzle that we're doing right now is just meant to show, that you can go in and modify WDLs and make your own WDLs too, to import to the BroadE methods repository.
Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Okay, so we are at time for this exercise. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward, since there aren't any further questions in the chat, unless anybody has one outstanding question that they want to ask for getting this loaded, for getting the little script loaded. Okay, all right. So our next step then is to configure our workflow. And if you were in the workshop earlier today, you got a little bit of practice with this using the data tables quick start that we ran. But right now I'm just going to go over a few best practices that I wanted to mention. And I also should say, for those of you who raised your hands in the last section, feel free to take your hands down, because we'll be doing that again in the next hands-on exercise. All right, so configuring workflows, best practices. All right, so we have three main best practices that I wanted to mention as you're getting started running data in Terra. And the first best practice is, when possible, reference your data table for your inputs to your workflow. And there are a couple of reasons for this. Now, you can manually, the first reason is that it allows you to iterate through the files. You can manually specify a cloud path. For example, this workflow is calling for a CRAN file. You could manually specify the URL for that CRAN file. But if you're running thousands of samples, you don't want to have to keep manually inputting all of the cloud locations for those files. If you organize your files into a data table, you can call those inputs from the data table, and your workflow will just iterate through it. And by using the data table as well, it allows you to search for certain inputs. So it's just a good way to organize the data when you're using multiple files. The second suggestion for a best practice is to use the workspace data table for workspace level metadata. So remember, on your data page, there's that other section with workspace data. Basically, if you have metadata that needs to be applied to most of your samples or all of your samples, it's a good idea to just go ahead and put that metadata into the table so that you can call this table when you're running your workflow. And we've already seen a couple examples of these, like reference files, so FASTA files that you might need for alignment. You can specify Docker images in your workspace data table if your Docker image might change slightly. Another example of this is if you are running a workflow that you plan to use on different species. Maybe you have some metadata that applies to one species and some that applies to another species. So by just making two separate references in this data table, you can easily switch it in your workflow configuration. The third best practice that I wanted to mention is to write your outputs back to the data table. And again, that's what we practiced earlier today when we were doing the data tables quick start. But the reason for this is that, once again, it allows you to organize your output files. You can imagine that if you're running thousands of samples, maybe you only need the output BAM file for one of those samples. If you write it to the data table, you can search the data table for that sample name and pull up your output. So it's a very quick way to access the files that you write in the cloud. A second reason is it allows you to chain workflows together. So you can imagine that maybe you have a couple of little workflows in your workspace, and one is used to pre-process the data, and then one is used to do something more specific. You can write the output of the first workflow to the data table and then use that output as input to the second workflow. And it can be a pretty seamless transition if it's in the data table, because you can set up your workflow to automatically be configured to pull from that output column from your first workflow. So again, data tables in general, they help you organize the data and they help you iterate through files. So today we're going to get some hands-on practice configuring that little puzzle that we just solved. And this should feel pretty familiar after doing the first data tables quick start tutorial that we did. But this is going to give you an opportunity to kind of go in and practice this a little more yourself at a slower pace. So I'm going to end my, well, here, actually, let me just show you, pull up kind of the instructions of what we're going to do. We're going to use that Whittle Puzzles workspace once again. And in that workspace, we're going to use the Hello World name data table that we created in there. I'll show that to you in a moment. And we're going to configure our workflow to use that data table. So again, I'm going to show this to you right now, and then I'm going to give you 10 minutes to do it on your own. All right. So let me get out of this and go back to that workflow. Okay, so let me show you the data page of this Easy Puzzles workspace. There are 3 data tables that we've created. This BAM and BAM set are designed to work with that advanced Whittle puzzle that we have in this workspace, which we're not doing today. But this Hello World name data table is designed to be used with that easy puzzle that we just solved. So this is a very simple data table that we made. We have a bunch of names, and we have an ID column for each of those names. And we want to take these names in as input to that Hello World workflow. and echo that name back. So we want our workflow to say, hello, Riley, and output that to a text file, which we're going to write to this hello world name data table. So to set this up, I'm going to go to my workflows page. When you clone this workspace and go to your workflows page, you'll notice 2 workflows that are available. These are the solved puzzles. So these are the answers to the Whittle puzzles. And then if you imported your own workflow, you should see that also as an option in your workflows page. So you want to go to the version of the puzzle that you solved, because this is not going to be configured yet to use any data. And what we want to do, again, is we want to pull our data from that data table that we have. So in this step 1, select root entity, the thing that I want to analyze are those names in that data table. So I'm going to choose the hello world name data table. And then I'm going to select the data that I want to run. I could choose to run on just one of these names, or I can make a set. I'm going to go ahead just for fun and run it on all 3 names and call this name set 1. You can if you're going to choose to run multiple files, you can name your set anything you want. And then I have to configure my input. So this is a simple workflow. It has just one single variable, that name, it's a string. And again, I want to pull that string from my hello world name data table. So I need to list the column. Does that work? Hang on. My Zoom is covering it up. Here we go. I need to list the column in my hello world name that has the actual name I want to echo in my script. And so I'm going to use that hello name column. So to set that up in my workflow, I'm going to type, open this up, this dot, and I'm going to choose the hello name column. Then I'm going to save. And then I also need to configure my outputs. So I'm going to go here. I have one output. It's called command. It writes to a file. I want to write this file back to my root entity data table. So once again, I'm going to use the this dot syntax so that Terra writes it back to my root entity table. And then I'm going to just come up with a name for my output column. I want to create a brand new column. So this is not something that's in that data table. I'm going to call it, we'll just call it output. So this dot output, or you could say my output. You can choose any name for this. I have a suggestion in the instructions, but again, you can choose any column name you want. I'm going to select save, and then I'm going to run the analysis and launch. Okay, and you can see once again, because we used the root entity data table, or sorry, the entity data table as input, each of those names is going to run through its own workflow. So we have 3 workflow launch submissions here. Okay, so we can come back and see how that changes our hello world name data table. We should see an output column appended here at the end of this. But now I'm going to go back to the slide deck and give you the opportunity to try configuring this workflow for yourself. So I have some instructions here. We will take 10 minutes to do this. I probably don't need 10 minutes, but we'll go ahead and just take them. And so we'll come back at 3:43. And once again, please raise your hand after you've launched your workflow. And I can take questions while we're doing this, if anyone needs to see anything again or has any questions about the process. I see some people have already finished too. That's great. I'm glad you were able to follow along. And I just saw a message that we are actually running a little behind time. So I am going to cut this exercise short. It looks like people flew through that configuration too. So I'm glad that that wasn't too painful for people. So again, the instructions for that workspace are on the dashboard, and there is a step-by-step guide. So if you didn't quite get to fully configuring and launching your workflow, you can still go back after the workshop and try this for yourself. So, but for right now, I'm going to go ahead and move forward. And I just want to make sure, okay, can someone just confirm you can hear me okay and that you can see the screen okay?
Yes, I can hear you and can see your exercise 2 slide.
Great, thank you. Okay. So I just want to, I'll go briefly go over these how to find. This should look familiar, and then we're going to do some troubleshooting guides. So finding workspaces, we already talked about showcase section in Terra. You can find workflows in the showcase library in curated workspaces. And if you do find a workflow that you want to try, you can either copy the showcase workspace, or you can copy just the workflow from that workspace into your own workspace. You can also find workflows in DocStore and in the BroadE methods repository, which we just tried out. For those that don't know, DocStore is a GA4GH compliant resource for Docker-based tools, such as Whittle scripts. Okay, and lastly, I just want to go over a few troubleshooting tips. So there's basically two things you can do to troubleshoot workflows when you find that your workflow has failed. So if you check your job history, the first thing you can do is check failure messages that result next to that failed status. I'll go a little bit more into that in a moment. And you can also analyze the standard error logs of failed tasks. And we recommend doing both the failed task and the one before it. And some common failure messages are localization failures. So that means that your file didn't localize. The Terra couldn't find it. It's either because you don't have access to it, maybe you didn't have the right permissions, or the file doesn't exist. So if someone accidentally deleted a file that you're trying to use from the Google bucket, your workflow will fail. Another common failure message is when your workflow fails immediately, it usually is an indication that you had an incorrect sample or workspace variable. So when you're configuring that workflow, let's say you specified the wrong column name, maybe you made a typo in it or something, that would cause your workflow to fail immediately. I also want to point out that we have troubleshooting guides available in our knowledge base. So definitely check that out as you're getting on board Terra. For troubleshooting workflow submissions using the job history and the workflow dashboard, when you click into the submission status of a run, you'll have the option to check out the dashboard. It's this little dashboard icon. This is an alpha feature that we have in Terra. And when you select that, you'll come to a page that will give you a workflow failed message that you can dive into a little bit further. The other thing you can do is on that submission page, check out the link to the job manager. This is going to take you into a view where you can look at the different tasks that ran and see errors related to specific tasks. So again, we recommend reading the error message for the task that failed, but then go back into this list view and check out the log file for the task that ran before it, because sometimes you can find out information from the previous task as well. And this is just a little shot of what those logs will look like. Okay, some common failure messages that you might get. You might see something like a POPI error code 9. That's a task that failed on the virtual machine. So this could result from that localization failure that I mentioned earlier, or it could be that because you have incorrect commands or arguments. And then another one that you'll see is a POPI error code 10. And this means that the machine failed to complete the operation. And this could be due to insufficient memory or disk. So maybe your workflow didn't specify enough memory to run the task. But also I want to call it that sometimes you just get transient failures. And if you were to relaunch the workflow, it would work okay. The last kind of common error message that you might receive is a job exited on a return code. It'll give you a non-zero return code, which has not been declared as a valid return code. If you get this error in there, we recommend going into the log and searching for the word error and seeing what you find in the actual log file. That was kind of a whirlwind on troubleshooting, but again, we do have documentation on this in our knowledge base. So please check out this article as you're working in Terra if you should come across any problematic workflow submissions. All right, so just some next steps. We have some resources available that you can check out that are related to workflows, our video tutorials. Again, we have showcase workspaces that you can try to get more practice using workflows. We also have step-by-step instructions for finding Whittles both in DocStore and the BroadE methods repository. And we do have some links here to Docker resources as well. All right. And so with that, I can take questions. Any last minute questions about workflows? All right, then I'm going to turn it over to Ali, who's going to go over billing. Oh, sorry, we're doing interactive analysis next. So I will hand this off.
That's right. I'll take over next. All right. So the next session is going to be about cloud environments and interactive analysis in Terra. This this session's a bit different. I redesigned it a bit based on the rapidly evolving features in interactive analysis. And we used to do in this workshop, we used to do a hands-on analysis in Jupyter Notebooks. Actually, not going to do that today, but I'm going to recommend that exercise as homework. What we're going to do today in the next about half an hour or so is just get you familiar with what the Terra cloud environment is, so that when you want to go start to try to run your favorite application, if it's available, it's supported in Terra so far, it's not a black box. You're like, I'm kind of familiar with Terra, but I don't know how to start this application. Hopefully we'll take away some of that uncertainty and give you a sense of what it's like to start a cloud environment, what it's like to launch a couple of our applications. And then you can hopefully go from there to start trying it out, playing around on your own. So this is a new tutorial, and I hope to turn it into a more robust offline tutorial in the near future. So so I'll say, so it might be a little bit rougher on the edges. We'll see how it goes. It's going to be a little bit more, require a little less brain space than the last few tutorials. So you can it'll be a little bit of a mental breather. So, okay, I'm going to start with a couple slides. Then we're going to jump into the application and start up a cloud environment. Usually takes a few minutes. We'll come back to a few slides and we'll go back and try out a few things. So I'm going to present my screen. All right, can you see my slide and only my slide?
Yes.
Okay, good. My windows are behaving a little strangely, but I think it's okay. All right, so you've seen how to organize data in Terra. You've tried it out. You've had a chance to run some workflows, chance to work on some whittle puzzles and run those. That's great, but you also want to be able to inspect, visualize, and apply algorithms to data interactively. It'd be great to work on those things in real time in the cloud, so you don't have to bring your data somewhere else, bring it to your local computer, which kind of defeats the purpose of being in the cloud in the first place. So as a solution to that, Terra features customizable cloud environments. I just wanted to stop my video because I was having a little bit of connection problems before, so I just want to make sure I've got enough bandwidth here. Okay. Yeah, so Terra has customizable cloud environments for applications you might already know and use: Jupyter Notebooks, RStudio, Galaxy, Bioconductor, Hail, and more being supported all the time. And what a cloud environment is, it's a virtual machine, either pre-configured or customized on your own. And you run the application on the cloud and use it as if it were on your regular workstation. You can install additional packages as you need them. You can access cloud-hosted data, do your work in the environment, and then save that data to persistent storage. The persistent disk attached to the cloud environment, you can think of it kind of like a USB drive. You can detach it and reattach it to a new cloud environment. Even if you delete that cloud environment, which I'll show you in a few minutes, your persistent disk does not go away unless you specifically request to delete it. And more recently, we have support for GPUs. If you're interested in machine learning applications, this is in beta, so I think there's still some things that the Terra team is working out. But you can launch a cloud environment with GPUs and run machine learning applications like TensorFlow and PyTorch. And I think the Cumulus workspace I showed you earlier actually does have a component which runs with PyTorch and GPUs, if I recall. Okay, so that is the 30,000-foot overview of cloud environment. I'm going to have us go back to our browser. We're going to find a workspace, clone it, and then practice launching a cloud environment to run a Jupyter Notebook. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing PowerPoint. I'm going to share my browser. So while I'm bringing this up, you can go back and bring your Terra bring Terra back up in your browser. Okay, so let's go back to the showcase section. And I could have chosen any workspace, but I'm going to choose one that just kind of may look familiar to people just because it's a scientific study-based workspace. And if you click on the GWAS tag here, it'll bring up a couple options. The first of which is this reproducible GWAS workspace that we developed in collaboration with the Manning Lab here at BroadE for a workshop we did at the ASHG meeting a couple of years ago. And it reproduces the fundamental steps in a genome-wide association study. So let's go ahead and click on that. And as you recall, I'm not the owner of this workspace. This is a read-only workspace. So let's go ahead and clone it to make our own copy. Remember to add a unique suffix to your workspace. I like to do my initials and the date, which is the 13th. I think I'm not actually on the, so I'm gonna just choose the one that I usually do. You choose your appropriate building project and hit clone. So if you're interested in this workspace and you're not aware of it before, I highly recommend trying it out. It's a, it has an analysis that's structured in order to reproduce this genome-wide association study. It's a nice, concise tutorial. If we're not going to run the analysis today, that's not the point of this session. This session is more just to get you hands-on with what's it like to launch a cloud environment so that you could do this analysis. But if you wanted to come back to this later, very much encourage you to do so. Okay, so you should have had your workspace should now be cloned. I just want to go to the Notebooks tab, and you'll see that there are a couple notebooks in this tutorial. We could choose either of these to launch. I'm going to choose the first one, the initial analysis completed notebook. And when you click on that, it's going to open the notebook in a preview mode. This is so you can view the contents of the notebook without having yet launched a cloud environment. In fact, you don't even need to have cloned the workspace to do this. If you just had read access to a workspace like we did for the original one, you could look at this without needing to create cloud environment. But I want to actually show you how we would edit and run it. And to do that, we need to start a cloud environment. So if you look in the upper right-hand corner of your browser, you'll see what's called the cloud environment widget. This is where you launch and where you configure and launch a cloud environment that would support an application like Jupyter Notebooks like we have here. I'm not going to go into detail about Jupyter Notebooks today. We have tutorials. We have lots of great articles in the Terra knowledge base about Jupyter Notebooks and how to run them on Terra. I'm going to give very, very high level overview. You're just going to get a sense of what it looks like. We're not going to really run anything today. And I'm sure there's lots of tutorials out there beyond Terra for Jupyter Notebooks. If you're brand new to notebooks, we'll come back. I'm going to show you a slide in a minute. But let's get to the point of starting our cloud environment. So if you click on the gear icon, this opens up the configuration options for your cloud environment. It suggests a default environment, which for the purposes of this tutorial, this workspace about the genome-wide association study, you could go ahead and use that, I think. You would want to double check the dashboard to make sure that it doesn't have some specific instructions. And we're going to see that in a few minutes with another workspace that we'll take a look at. But for today's purposes, it doesn't matter too much. We can just use the default environment. Now, if you wanted to change it, you click on this Customize button. And you might have noticed that, in fact, I'm even jumping the gun a little bit. Let me come back to that. Let's just start it. Let's just hit the Create button. And why I'm doing this now is because it's going to take a few minutes. It's going to take about 2 or 3 minutes to start up the cloud environment. And I want to come back to it. So let's just do that now. So go ahead and hit the Create button with the default settings. And you'll see that the status of the widget has changed. It now says creating at the cost of 6 cents an hour. And there's this, circular arrow icon to indicate that that's starting up. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing my browser. We'll come back to it. Again, it's gonna take about 3 minutes, so we can take a look at a few slides while we do that. Okay. All right, so going back to my slides. Just talk for a moment about the basic components of the Terra cloud environment. The first of which is an application configuration. So that's the software and dependencies that are pre-installed or installing now in the cloud environment container. The cloud compute profile, which is this section down here, highly customizable. You can change the disk space, number of CPUs, the memory. You can use Spark clusters if that would help your analysis. You may have to balance cost and compute power, and those are choices that you can make. And the cost estimates in this blue rectangle up help you do that. So I didn't show it to you, but I'll show you in a few minutes that when you change these options, it'll give you an updated estimate, which is really, really helpful to see. Suppose I wanted 16 CPUs, how much would that cost me? And you can just select it before you create it. You don't have to create the environment to get that estimate. And it'll just tell you, it would cost you this to use 4 CPUs. It would cost you that to do 16 CPUs. Sometimes you don't have a choice. Maybe your application and the compute you need to do requires it. And then you're like, well, I need to use 16 CPUs, so that's what it's going to be. But at least at least it's some upfront cost. And then there's a persistent disk, which I mentioned is kind of like the detachable USB storage device on the cloud for your virtual machine. You can customize the size of that. And I do want to point out a couple things to be aware of if you're just getting used to cloud environments, just trying them out, is that if you on the fly wanted to change the size of your persistent disk, if you want to make it larger, that's great. You can go to the cloud environment widget and increase the size and hit update. But suppose you wanted to downsize it, you do have to be really careful because you can and I think will lose data if you do that. So if you need to do that, be sure to back up any files that are in the persistent disk that you might need. So just be really careful about changing your persistent disk and be aware that if you're not careful, you might lose some data. This diagram is just to give you a sense of how do cloud environments fit into the Terra architecture. And actually, some of this is going to be a little more clear, I think, later when Ali follows me with some more about how does billing and cloud computing components fit together into the Terra architecture. Just for now, assume that you as a Terra user are working under a billing project, which for the purpose of today's workshop, everyone is. And you create a new workspace. And we call that workspace A. That new workspace has its own cloud storage bucket, new cloud storage bucket associated with it. It has data tables where you organize data. And then say you launch a cloud environment like we're doing right now. That is associated with the workspace. And it's only available to you as the user. It consists of the compute engine that talks to the persistent disk, talks to the VM boot disk. And there's also, I'll show you, there's a terminal window you can open in Terra for interacting with your cloud environment on the command line, which is really useful, particularly when it comes to moving files. And just so you know how that interacts with another workspace, say you create a second workspace, workspace B, that's a new cloud storage bucket associated with the workspace. It's new data tables, and you launch a cloud environment, it's a different cloud environment. Now, say you delete, say you're working in workspace A and you say, okay, I'm done with my cloud environment. I don't need it anymore. I want to keep my persistent disk though. I'll show you this in a few minutes, but you can delete your cloud environment, but keep your persistent disk. And then if you start a new cloud environment, that persistent disk will automatically reattach to the new cloud environment. And because our first brief demo is with Jupyter Notebooks, if you're not familiar with the Jupyter Notebook, it's a open source interactive web tool. Think of it like a computational lab notebook where you can write code, work with computational output, write explanatory text and documentation, and even work with multimedia resources in a single document, and in supported languages like R and Python and not supported in Terra, but I think Julia is the one that the JU in Jupyter is for. But anyway, they're a great feature for writing reproducible computational biology. It's been supported in Terra from the start, and a lot of our showcase analyses make use of notebooks. All right, so let's go back to the browser. Let's check to see if your cloud environment has finished. It should have by now. If anyone is still, if their cloud environment is still creating, maybe raise your hand, and our TAs can help troubleshoot. But you should be good by now. All right, so I'm going to go back to my browser. Okay, so how I know my cloud environment is running now is that circular arrow icon has changed to a pause button. And that means the current status is running. And if I wanted to stop it, wanted to pause it, I would click that pause button. Tells me it's running at 6 cents an hour. And now I can click the edit button. And what it's doing is loading the Jupyter Notebook in the edit function so that I could actually modify these cells within the notebook. I could run them and recreate the analysis in this tutorial workspace or any other tutorial workspace. Just the briefest of overviews of Jupyter Notebook features. On the left is a table of contents for the notebook. And actually, when you run code cells, a lot of our notebooks in the TOC, it will color code what's still running and what's done. There's a menu bar at the top, and then some shortcut icons below. You can see what language is currently, which language kernel is currently being run. It says Python 3. You could switch that to R on the fly if you'd like, but it has to restart the kernel. Other reasons for restarting the kernel is there might have been an error that hangs the notebook. You might just want to restart it, or if you want to start fresh from the beginning of the notebook and clear your previous work, you could do that as well. Again, I'm not going to run any of the code cells in here. If you're interested, please go do so later. But for now, I just want to show you what it's like to say, okay, I'm done. I'm going to X out of this notebook. So that takes me back to the notebook tab of the workspace. And let's practice opening up the terminal. So if you look up to the cloud environment widget, there's a terminal icon here. Doesn't everyone go ahead and click on that? And what it does is it opens up a new tab, hopefully next to the one you were just working in. And here's a familiar looking terminal window. And just for the briefest and most simple demonstration, I'm just going to list the files. And I say, oh, there's a notebooks directory. And if I go into that notebooks directory and list the files, oh yeah, so here's some of the files in my notebooks directory that look familiar. Like, oh yeah, there's the name of the workspace and things like that. So you can continue to work in here and move files around, see what's there. Very, very useful and powerful for that. Okay, so what I want to do now is let's X out of, can close our terminal window. So I'm just going to close the tab. And let's say I'm done. Let's stop your cloud environment. Press that pause button. Might take about, I timed it earlier, it was about 2 minutes to pause. Now, a good feature for controlling costs is that Terra has an auto pause feature. So your cloud environment by default will pause after 30 minutes. And by pausing, it'll reduce the cost of keeping that cloud environment ready in the background. While it's paused, it'll still continue to accrue costs, but not at as high a rate. TAs can clarify, but I'm pretty sure you can adjust that auto pause timeout if you wish. But by default, it's 30 minutes. While it's pausing, I'm just thinking if there's anything else I wanted to mention here. By pausing your cloud environment, you don't lose anything. Your cloud environment stays associated with your workspace. Your persistent disk doesn't go anywhere. As soon as this is done pausing, we're going to go to your profile where you can view active cloud environments. I just want to wait till this is done. Okay, so my status has changed to stop, and my cost has gone down to 1 cent an hour to maintain this cloud environment. Okay, so I'm gonna go over to my profile section in Terra. That's by clicking on the left-hand drop-down menu, clicking the drop-down to the sub-menu below my name. I'm gonna click on Cloud Environments. Let's just show you all the cloud environments that you currently have associated with your account. So what I'll often do is just look at if I'm working with something that I just created, I look at the date and I see, okay, this is the one I just worked with. It was today at 3:51 p.m. Last accessed at 4:02, which was a minute ago. Okay, so, and here is the persistent disk, this one here, which costs $2 a month to maintain. So again, the cloud environment I was just working with is $0.01 cent per hour or less than $0.01 cent per hour. And my persistent disk is $2 per month. All right, let's delete the cloud environment. We didn't do anything, we don't need it. Let me show you how to do that. So I'm gonna follow across the one I was just working with, and I hit the delete cloud environment button. And then this pop-up comes up and it says, just to confirm, do you really want to delete the cloud environment? And then it asks you a question. It says, confirm, and to confirm, you would check the box, also delete the persistent disk and all files on it. So you can opt to keep your persistent disk, as I mentioned before. You can delete the cloud environment and keep your disk. Just for convenience, because I didn't do any work on it, I don't have anything I want to save, I'm going to go ahead and check that. Yes, I want to delete it at the same time and click OK. And then to see the status has changed to deleting for the cloud environment and has changed to deleting for the associated persistent disk. If you chose not to delete the persistent disk, it would be remounted to the next cloud environment you create for this workspace. Okay, TS, how am I doing on time? How much more time do I have for this section?
You can go till 4:15 and then we can take a 5-minute break and Allie can start at 4.
Excellent. All right, so let's create one more cloud environment that will practice a different application. We're gonna practice launching an RStudio cloud environment. I think there's probably a number of people here who'd be interested in seeing how that runs on Terra, runs on the cloud. So let's go back to workspaces. So we're gonna go to the workspaces section where you would see all the workspaces you have access to or ownership of. And we're gonna find a public workspace. I don't believe it's in the showcase section, but it's public and it was featured in a recent Terra blog post. And I'll have a link at the end of this slide deck to blog post about interactive analysis, because there's a lot of great information there about new applications and how to run them, and also some example cases of people using them. And this is one that comes from that blog post from a few weeks or a couple months ago. We have an example workspace that comes from the Manning Lab at BroadE about using a Shiny application, and Shiny is a package of our RStudio tools to do additional modes of analysis. And I just want to show you how to launch an RStudio environment from that workspace. So if you go up to the search workspaces bar and just type in the word Shiny, and And there are no hits in my workspaces, but there's a hit in the public workspace section. And we see this R-Shiny whole genome sequence association visualization workspace, which is public, and there's a blog post about it. So very much recommend this workspace if you're interested in running RStudio, and particularly our Shiny applications on RStudio and Terra. I'm just using this as an example. We're not going to go into specifics or even run the analysis, but I just want to have you guys practice launching a RStudio environment. I mentioned very quickly a few minutes ago that some workspaces, either from your colleagues or in the showcase section, might actually recommend custom environment options, and this one actually does. So it's always good to read the dashboard really carefully to make sure that you launch a cloud environment that can support the work that you want to do. Now you notice in the launch the application section that I'm showing here, it says launch an RStudio cloud environment from this workspace with at least 2 CPUs and 7.5 gigs of RAM. So I'm just going to keep that in mind. Say, okay, I want my cloud environment to have those features. For today's purposes, it probably doesn't matter because we're not going to run anything. But if you want to do it later, please be sure to do that. So, all right, so let's launch a new cloud environment for RStudio. So let's go to the widget. Terra just reminded me that says, oh, you don't have access to run analysis on this workspace. And you might be saying, oh, it's because you did not clone it. So let's go ahead and clone it. Choose your appropriate billing project, clone. Okay, so I now have my own copy of the workspace. Again, just to double check, I see that I've got my unique name to the workspace at the top. I'm the owner, access level is owner, great. Okay, so click on the gear icon in the cloud environment widget. And remember the instructions in the dashboard recommended a custom cloud environment. So it was 2 CPUs with 7.5 gigs of RAM, great. And I need a different application configuration because RStudio is not in the default one. Oh, and I should mention that a convenient way to check what's installed in the environment is by clicking on that what's installed here button. You can see all the things that are installed here. And that way you can see if there's things that you need that are not there, and you can then work on getting them into a custom environment. Anyway, so from the drop-down menu, you can see there's groups of pre-configured environments. There's Jupyter environments, the default one, some legacy ones for running some tools and older tutorials on Terra that still need those. And then if you go down towards the bottom, here is the community maintained RStudio environment. So I'm going to select that one. And I'm going to create. Let's take about 2 to 3 minutes. So I'm going to go back to my slide and just show you 1 or 2 more things there. Okay, so you've heard mentioned the tool GSUtil before. GSUtil is again going to be a really good friend to you for moving things around between your workspace cloud storage bucket and your cloud environment. And you can use that in the terminal of the cloud environment. So just be aware that that's going to be the tool you want to use for moving files around. And then the last one of these diagrams that I want to show you was about really just a relationship between different users. You know, I told you before about what it's like when you yourself, you've got a cloud environment for one workspace, you create a new workspace, and it's a different cloud environment. It's also a different cloud environment if your colleague is working in the same workspace. Say you are the owner of a workspace and you've got a collaborator who's been given co-ownership of the workspace. When they launch a cloud environment, it's going to be their own cloud environment that doesn't have a shared persistent disk. but it will be billed on the same, whatever billing project has been selected. So just be aware of that architecture of this. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my browser. By the time I get there, this environment should be just about ready. Still says creating. That should be ready in just a moment. And while that's finishing creating, it mentions, and if you're interested in this tutorial workspace, it mentions that once you launch the RStudio environment, you're actually going to need to install some dependencies to run the Shiny app. So just be aware. And if we had time, we might have done that next, but it does take a little bit of time. It takes 10 to 15 minutes, but we're not going to do that today. And this is, okay, now mine is now running. And if yours is not, it should be quite soon. And a new pop-up has appeared, and it's telling you that my cloud environment is ready. And there's a blue button to launch that cloud environment. So I'm going to go ahead and click launch. And here is an instance of RStudio that's running in my cloud environment in Terra. And if I wanted to continue with this tutorial, I would then type in the recommended commands from the dashboard to install those dependencies for the specific Shiny app, and then continue running the analysis. So yeah, that's how we would start an RStudio instance, and using that workspace as an example. So that's as far as we'll go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop that cloud environment. And again, this will take a couple minutes, so we can actually, and it's actually saying that this won't take about 4 minutes. I do recommend that during the break, you practice going back to your, clicked on the wrong thing, going back to the cloud environment section of your profile. And if you don't need it, just go ahead and delete that cloud environment. Because if you're not going to use it, it's just accruing costs that you don't need to be spending. Particularly if you're on a free credits account, it's just using up your free credits for something you're not going to use. If you are going to use it and you do want to try it later, then you could keep it around for a bit longer. But during the break, if you're not going to use it, come back here and practice deleting it. Okay, so that wraps up that section. That's the quick practice on taking the mystery out of how to launch any of these applications in Terra. What I didn't do today, didn't have time for, was launching an instance of Galaxy. Oh yeah, let me go back. I got one more slide. Yeah, so when you go to the PDF versions of the slides in the public folder, you'll get these links. I've linked the workspaces that we used as examples today, if you're interested. I recommend doing on your own our Notebooks Quick Start tutorial. It's great practice for, it actually gives you practice in building a cohort from the Data Explorer as well. So it's really from scratch that you build a cohort and then you run a simple analysis in a Jupyter Notebook. Recommend trying that out. There's links to our cloud environment section in the knowledge base. Links to the blog posts about interactive analysis, highly recommend those. There's some amazingly useful information in there. So do take a look at those, including, you can read the one about the RStudio and Shiny app workspace. And I didn't launch a Galaxy instance today. I didn't have you do that, but if you want to, and simply just for time, if you want to learn more about that, you can start here with this article in the knowledge base, and that'll get you started about how to run Galaxy in Terra. And you may have noticed that in the Notebooks tab, on the left side of the page in the Notebooks tab, there's a button to launch Galaxy. So you actually launch Galaxy from there. Okay, that concludes the quick tutorial on how to launch a cloud environment. Feel free to ask any questions, and I'll turn it over to Ali to tell you about collaboration and billing and security in Terra, which are very important things. So I definitely recommend giving an ear to this section.
So I'm going to set up my share while people are taking a quick break. I think this is Allie. I think we said we have a 5-minute break.
Oh,
Is
yes.
that right?
5-minute break.
Yeah.
Yep.
Come back at
4:22.
4:22. And I'm gonna share my screen to make sure I'm all set. Okay. Okay. In this session, I'm going to talk about very briefly how to predict and monitor what you spend. I'm going to talk about the billing structure in Terra and how to set it up so that you can minimize expensive surprises. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how to protect resources like controlled data and other resources. So let's go along. First is, I'm sure everyone is interested in how do you predict and monitor what you are spending in Terra. So what costs money, how much does it cost, and how can you minimize cloud costs on Terra? So the platform is free to use, the infrastructure, but operations like running workflows, running a notebook, some of the things you did today, and accessing and storing data may incur Google Cloud Platform charges. There are 3 kinds of charges. There's VM compute costs. Those are the VMs that run your workflows and the interactive analyses like notebooks and RStudio and Galaxy. And those costs depend on what kind of instance you have. High computing costs more and preemptibles cost less, and how long you're using them. So the CPU hours. There's data storage, and that's anything in your workspace bucket or your cloud environment persistent disk. And that includes derived data from a workflow, which gets automatically written to the workspace bucket. And then the last charge is data egress, which is when you're moving data. For example, if you move data that's hosted in an external bucket and you want to store it in your workspace bucket, but it's in a different storage region, or if you're accessing data in requester pays buckets. So first, let's talk about estimating workflow spend. You saw on the dashboard that there are cost estimates in the dashboard descriptions. All of our well-documented pipelines will include those, and it will give you an estimate of how much time and money is required to run specific workflows against specific amounts of input data. You can use built-in cost reporting in the job history page that we covered. If you haven't used it before, there's a link to how to set it up, documentation in here. In both these cases, you'll run on a small sample to get an idea of how much it costs, and then multiply to scale and add a buffer for failed jobs if you're going to run on a lot of data. And then the last way you can estimate workflow spend is to use the workflow cost estimator notebook, which is in it's a featured workspace in our collection. When you're running an interactive analysis, you can estimate the interactive analysis costs. When you set up the environment, you're going to adjust the settings, and that will optimize the VM and disk, and you'll know exactly how much you're paying per unit time. And then you're going to get the costs in the widget, and to calculate the total cost, you're going to take the cost per hour and multiply by the hours that your interactive analysis machine is active, plus the cost of the persistent disk, which is a cost per month. Robert mentioned the auto pause function, which saves money because it will keep your interactive analysis from running forever if it's not doing anything. And there's a link to documentation on that here. And then the third piece you want to be able to estimate is your cloud storage costs. You can see an estimated cloud storage cost in the dashboard of your workspace, and that's an amount per month, and it depends on how much is in your workspace bucket. And then the last piece is egress costs. These are less known, but whenever you're moving data from between buckets, Google Cloud buckets that are in different regions, there's a price to move that. And when you go to download a file from the table or in another bucket, you'll get a little file details modal that shows you how much it costs to download that file. You can compare with the storage costs, and that can help you decide if you want to download data, if you have a lot of data that's generated that you maybe want to move to cheaper storage. You can see how the egress charges are in it and decide if that makes sense to pay to download it and then put it in less expensive storage. So those are different ways of estimating or finding cloud costs on Terra. You can also go to the Google Cloud Platform console. And if you're a cloud billing account owner or admin, which I'll talk about in a little bit, you can get the full monthly spend reports on console. These are actual costs that are broken down by the type of fee it is, compute, storage, and so on. Remember that your workflow VM and your interactive analysis VM costs are going to be lumped together. And there's a link to step-by-step instructions for how to access and interpret these costs. So there are a few things you can do to reduce your cloud costs. Terra has some built-in features that help, and we have quite a bit of documentation on recommendations for saving on workflow costs, cloud environment costs, and storage costs. So on workflow, as far as workflow costs, these are four built-in features. You can delete intermediate files, which are files generated in the middle of a workflow, and depending on your workflow, those can be quite a bit. We had one customer that was quite large that when they went back and deleted their intermediate files, I think they saved more than half their storage costs. So that can be really, really good. You could use call caching or checkpointing or preemptible VMs, which can also save you anywhere between 60 and 90%. And those are just virtual machines that if someone else wants to use that resource, you might get preempted. And so if you're not as worried about when your calculations get done, that can be a really cost-effective compute resource. For cloud environment costs, you can, we have a few recommendations. One is to make sure you size your application compute appropriately. You are paying for the compute you specify no matter if it's doing calculations or not. So you don't want to choose a machine that's way more power than you need because you're just paying for computation that you don't really need. You can move your generated data to regional or nearline storage from your persistent disk, and you can make sure that you're using that auto pause function so you don't keep running a VM that's not actually doing any work. For storage costs, again, you'll want to ask yourself, how much are you storing, where are you storing it, and how frequently do you need to access it? And that can, when you answer all those questions, you might have a better idea of a cheaper way to store it. You can move your data to regional or nearline storage. And again, the documentation is right there. The last thing you can do if you are the owner or an admin, again, on the billing account, is you can set budget alerts on Google Cloud Platform Console. And these can be really useful if you're nervous about how much you're spending. If you have a fixed amount of money and you don't want to run over, this is a really good resource for that. You can choose the budget scope. It can be the cloud billing account level or the workspace level, because each workspace has its own Google project. You can choose what kind of cost, what kind of service, storage, compute, or egress you want to limit. You can set an amount and a time, and the amount can be a fixed dollar amount or a fraction of the total. The time can correspond to your grant proposal, for example, or it can be monthly. And then you can set what the alert does. You can notify the owner, you can notify other users up to 5. And there, again, there's links to all of that at the bottom. So that's a recap of what you are spending. Let's talk about billing structure and setup on Terra. How does billing work and how can you minimize expensive surprises? Terra runs on the Google Cloud Platform, and soon it will be multi-cloud, and it will run on Google and on Azure. And all of Terra costs are actually Google fees that are paid for by, right now, a Google Cloud billing account that you link to Terra. So this is the overall structure. Let me see if I can get my mouse over here. This is the overall structure with the cloud billing account at the top. And underneath the cloud billing account is a Terra billing project, and each Terra billing project is linked to that umbrella cloud account. And it's a pass-through that is assigned to the workspace when you created it. So you all saw that you had to have a Terra billing project to create the workspace, and that project defined what ultimately pays for the work that you're doing, which all happens. I don't know why this is skipping around, so I apologize. That happens at the workspace level. All the fees are charged per workspace, regardless of who does the analysis or whether they have access to the billing project. So I want to reiterate that. A person who has the right permission can work in your workspace, and it gets passed by the workspace Terra billing project to the cloud billing account, even if the user in the workspace is not included as a billing account user. So I'm going to reiterate that again, but I'm going to state it here as well. So access in Terra to all of these resources and additional resources like data, which I'll talk about, is based on permissions or roles. Each level in this hierarchy is a resource, and each resource has an owner and other users as well with other roles. Each role allows you to perform specific actions, and owners control the access by granting permission to other users. So that's the big picture. Let's start at the top and talk about what permissions allow you to do what things. So at the cloud billing account level, owners and admins and users can all create Terra billing projects. Owners and admins can access those detailed cost reports on GCP console, and owners and admins can grant billing account permission to other collaborators. So the billing roles determine who can create and manage resources. At the top level, it's who can create and manage the resources below. And this is what it looks like if you're a cloud billing account owner. When you go to your billing page, it looks like this, and you see that at the top, it will list, it will allow you to create billing projects. So if you own or have user privileges on that top cloud account, you can create billing projects, and that will look like this. So the next level is the Terra billing project. You can be an owner or a user. Owner and users both can create Terra workspaces, just like you did in the session before this. And owners can grant other users permission to access the billing project. And again, billing roles determine who can create and manage resources. And that will look like this. If you are an owner or an admin on a billing project, you'll be able to add users to the billing project. And if you're a user, this won't show up for you, but the billing project will be in the dropdown when you try to create or clone a workspace. So the bottom level is the workspace, and workspace permissions and roles determine who can perform actions with a cost, who can spend money. So roles include owner, and they can do everything. Writer, and writers can change the dashboard, and usually writers are able to do computations. Readers, who can just read and usually can't do any work. And in Terra, there's a specific can share and can compute, so you can restrict a little bit more when you share those. So costs for these roles are charged to the workspace billing project. So it's a little bit like the electricity in a house. Doesn't matter who's turning on the light switch, the person who's on the utility bill is the one who's going to be paying. And this is just a chart that summarizes what we said, and you can look at that later. I'm going to reiterate that billing roles let you create and manage resources, and workspace roles determine who can spend money. And then when you're an owner of any resource, like a billing project or a workspace, that allows you to control other people's access. So we're going to try 2 examples to illustrate this and to really drive home the point. And I am running short on time, but I'm going to try and run through this quickly. The first example is who can make their own workspace. So we have a workspace, and it's under a Terra billing project, and we have these 4 users. The first is the workspace owner. He's obviously the billing project owner. The second collaborator is a workspace writer, and belong to a different billing project, B, they're a user. The third collaborator is a writer in the workspace. They don't have any billing project. And the last is a workspace reader who is a user on billing project A. So let's take them left to right. The workspace owner, who also owns the billing project, can that person make a copy of their workspace? Shout it out in chat. I'll give you a hint. Owners can do almost everything. Anyone? No? Well, that was a softball. I was hoping someone would answer, but the answer is the owner can, of course, copy the workspace. How about the next collaborator? They're a workspace writer, and they use billing project B. Can they copy the workspace? Well, billing project. If you have a billing project, you can usually copy the workspace. And yes. How about the next collaborator? They're a workspace writer, and they don't have any billing project of their own. Can they copy the workspace? No. And the last person is a reader on the workspace, and they are user on the billing project. You think they can copy the workspace? Make their own copy? Unless they have been given share permission, they cannot copy the workspace. I'm going to keep moving. I know people are leaving a little bit, so I'm hoping this is making sense. Because this example is the one that usually trips people up. So you own a workspace and you are the owner of the billing project A, and we're going to play who can work in your workspace. We have you, and you have 3 collaborators with whom you have shared the workspace. The first is a workspace writer who doesn't have any billing project. Well, actually, first is you, the owner. Can you work in the workspace? The answer is yes, of course you can work in the workspace. Next, we have workspace writer. So you've given them write permission on the workspace. Can they, but they don't have any billing project. Can they work in your workspace? Anyone? Take a wild guess. You have a 50% chance of being right. Raise your hand if you think the writer who doesn't have, I got Charlotte Mampos says, yes, because you pay. Correct. The writer does not have their own billing project, but working in your workspace, they can bill and it's charged to your billing project. How about the next person who is a reader and they have a billing project? They are on your billing project, but they only have read access of the workspace. Any idea? Can they do work? I guess not. Exactly right. They cannot perform activities for the cost in the workspace. How about the last collaborator? They're a writer and they're a user of the billing project. I'll give it to you. Yes, they can do work in the workspace. So that exercise is meant to show you that it's really, really, really not the billing project allows someone to create their own workspace and then they can work. But if you only share a workspace, that allows your collaborators to do work and it gets charged to you. So it can be hard to keep track of who has permission for different resources, especially if you have a large lab. And one way you can manage is to use manage groups. So you assign permission to a group rather than an individual. And you can do that in the groups page. You can assign roles and you can update as needed. And that way you share, like you can share your workspaces or you can share billing with a group and you can update the group and you don't have to change every single resource. So now that we've talked about the billing structure, we've talked about what costs money, let's talk about how to set up billing. And this is going to have quite a few references to resources that are in our support. So hopefully you'll see that there are a couple of different ways to pay for costs when you're working in Terra that don't all involve setting up billing. So first is you can work in a collaborator shared workspace. So if someone's already working in Terra, they can compute permission to work in their workspace. Your costs are covered by their billing project. The second option is someone who owns a Terra billing project can let you use their billing project, in which case you can create or clone your own workspace to work in. And your workspace costs are then covered by their billing project. So that's an interesting piece and a little bit, yeah, a little bit counterintuitive. And then the next piece is you can use your own cloud billing. You would set up a cloud billing account, link it to Terra, and you can use the linked account to create your own Terra billing project and create or clone a workspace. And very quickly, there's two options for setting up a Google Cloud billing account. One is to create your own account on Google Cloud Platform Console. There are just instructions for this. You can use getting started credits from Google. If you are a BroadE, you can request a BroadE cloud billing sub account, or you can use an institution or personal credit card to set one up. And the second option is to use a third-party reseller, which will do the work for you, an interface between Google Cloud and or GCP and you, so you don't have to go into the cloud to the console. So last piece I want to talk about is how to protect controlled data and other resources. Security is built into Terra, which is nice. Robert talked a bit about how Terra leverages security features on Google Cloud Platform. It's certified FISMA moderate, it's FedRAMP authorized, and don't remember if you added that we have a 15-minute logout that is a NIST compliance requirement for clinical researchers. And Terra does all the configurations so you don't have to. Uses built-in security features that authenticate. Every step requires authentication, not just it. So you don't just log into Terra once and that's all. You have free reign. Whenever you access a workspace, are you authorized to do that? Whenever you're accessing data sets, are you authorized to do that? Control data requires authorization domains to access. Control data is logged. It's on a different system with alerts, and all data in transit and data at rest are encrypted. And Liz already covered authorization domains, so I'm not going to reiterate, but I did want to talk about, there's often a little bit of confusion between authorization domains versus managed groups. So all authorization domains are managed groups, but not all managed groups are authorization domains. So managed groups are a way to grant permission once to a set of individuals. You can share a workspace, grant canned compute permission, or include a group on a Terra billing project. And authorization domains are strictly defined and enforce a special kind of workspace permission that follows copies of the workspace to protect control data and all of the generated data. So here's a list of additional resources, and that is the end for me. I'm a few minutes late, but I apologize. It's kind of it's an important topic. So I will field questions, and if you have questions, put them in the chat. And if you don't have questions, there's a link to today's slides, and we ask that you please take it's not quite 5 o'clock. So if you have 5 minutes to complete the survey, and the link will be in the chat, we really appreciate it. It really helps us to know how to improve these workshops.